Hey everyone! Tonight we are stepping back into a world where the sun doesn't just shine, it punishes. Imagine yourself standing on a ridge in the year 711, looking down at the valley of the Guadalete. The air is so thick with heat and dust that you can almost chew it. Below you, there's a sight that feels like a glitch in the matrix of history. On one side, you have the Visigothic king Roderick, sitting atop a silver-encrusted throne that is somehow being carried into battle because, why walk when you can be gaudy? He's surrounded by heavy infantry and noblemen in thick, clanking iron. On the other side, you see Tariq ibn Ziyad's forces. They aren't a wall of metal. They are a shimmering, shifting wave of leather, light fabric, and lean horses that look like they haven't eaten a carb in 3 years. You re-watching the moment, the unstoppable European heavy metal tradition meets the can-touches reality of North African skirmish tactics. It's a mismatch for the ages, like bringing a sledgehammer to a mosquito fight. Spoilers, the mosquito is about to win. Now, let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive this. You'd likely pass out from a mix of dysentery and heat exhaustion before the first javelin even left a Moorish hand. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I love seeing where these journeys reach, so drop your location and your local time in the comments. It's always cool to see who's awake in the middle of the night with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the ground vibrate before you see the cause. This isn't the rhythmic thumping of a heavy cavalry trot. It's a chaotic, syncopated rhythm. As you look toward the horizon, the Moorish light cavalry, the jinetes, emerge from the haze. They don't look like the knights you've seen in movies. There are no full suits of chainmail here. Instead, you see men in flowing tunics, perhaps a hardened leather vest, and a simple metal cap wrapped in a turban. They carry short, sturdy spears and those iconic heart-shaped shields made of boiled hide. They look under-equipped, almost fragile compared to the ironclad giants across the field. But as you watch them move, you realize they aren't riding their horses. They are part of them. The Visigothic nobles are grumbling. You can hear the clink of their mail as they shift uncomfortably. They expect a proper fita, hidden collision, where the strongest man wins. But the Moorish riders aren't interested in your ideas of a fair fight. They gallop toward the lines, let out a piercing cry, hurl a flurry of javelins that whistle through the air like angry hornets. And then, just as the Visigoths raise their swords to strike, the riders are gone. They've wheeled their horses around in a circle and are already 50 yards away, laughing over their shoulders. It's a martial dance called al-karr, l-farr, the attack and the retreat. To the Franks and the Goths, this looks like cowardice. To you, watching from the safety of the ridge, it looks like a lethal game of keep-away. One mainstream historical fact to keep in your back pocket: the Battle of Guadalete wasn't just a skirmish. It was the total collapse of the Visigothic kingdom in a single afternoon, because their leadership was so centralized around the king. Once Roderick vanished, likely drowned in the river, because his heavy armor acted like an anchor. The entire state machinery just evaporated. It's a classic example of putting all your eggs in one very heavy metal basket. Meanwhile, the Berber and Arab forces were decentralized, fast, and remarkably adaptable. While you're processing that, hear us a quirky tidbit. The Moorish riders often used a specific type of bit for their horses that allowed for extreme, instantaneous control, the Mameluke or curb bit. But the real secret weapon? They supposedly used a mixture of vinegar and strong herbs to wash their horses' legs. Believing it tightened the tendons and kept the animals from getting heavy in the Iberian heat. Imagine the smell of 1,000 salt and vinegar horses charging at you. It's a sensory experience history books usually skip. Historians still argue whether it was the superior tactics of the Moors or the internal betrayal of the Visigothic nobles that truly handed Spain over to the Umayyad Caliphate. Some say the nobles purposefully pulled their wings back to let Roderick fail, not realizing they were inviting an occupation that would last nearly 800 years. You see the confusion on the field. The right wing of the Visigothic army just stops. They watch, they wait, and in that moment of hesitation, the Moorish light cavalry finds the gap. You watch as a group of Berbers, riding without the heavy high-backed saddles of the Europeans, lean so far off their horses they're almost horizontal. They're picking up dropped javelins from the ground at a full gallop. It's a level of horsemanship that feels alien to the rigid Sturafevi style of the north. The Frankish heavy knight is built for one thing: the charge. He is a biological tank. But a tank is only useful if the target stays still. As you watch the Goths try to organize a countercharge, they look like they're trying to catch the wind with a net. Every time they lunge, the wind just shifts. The heat is starting to get to you now. You can see the shimmer of the sun off the river. The Visigoths are thirsty. Their heavy quilted sub-armor is soaking up sweat until it weighs twice as much as it did at breakfast. They are trapped in a literal oven of their own making. Meanwhile, the Moorish riders are dressed for the climate. Their mobility isn't just about their horses. It's about their survival in an environment that wants to kill anything that moves too slowly. You realize that outmaneuvering isn't just about speed on the battlefield. It's about being the one who isn't dying of heat stroke before the sun hits its zenith. As the sun begins to dip, the Visigothic line finally snaps. It doesn't break all at once. It frays. Small groups of knights realize the king is gone, and the cowards who keep throwing spears are actually winning. They turn to flee toward the river, but their horses are blown. The heavy destriers, bred for power, are foaming at the mouth, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The nimble North African horses, however, seem to have a second wind. They pick off the stragglers with terrifying efficiency. You see the tragedy of it: the heavy armor that was meant to protect these men has become their sarcophagus. They can't run, they can't swim, and they certainly can't catch the men who are killing them. You take a deep breath, the smell of dry earth and spent adrenaline filling your lungs. This is just the beginning. The next few centuries won't be about one battle. They'll be about a fundamental clash of philosophies. On one side, the belief that power comes from the weight of the blow. On the other, the knowledge that power comes from the person who is still standing when the other guy is too tired to lift his arm. It's a lesson the heavy knights of Europe are going to have to learn the hard way. Over and over again, in the dust of the Meseta, you lean back against a weathered cork tree, the rough bark scratching through your tunic as you watch a Moorish jinete light cavalryman maintain his gear just a few yards away. The sun is high now, casting short, sharp shadows across the dry earth. This isn't the lumbering, industrial-scale maintenance you'd see in a Frankish camp, where blacksmiths are constantly hammering out dents in heavy plate. No, this is different. It's quiet. It's methodical. You watch him inspect his saddle, and you realize you're re-looking at a piece of engineering that changed the face of the peninsula. The saddle is small, almost minimalist, sitting low on the horse's back. Unlike the high-picked wooden chairs used by the northern knights to keep them from being knocked off during a heavy lance impact, this saddle is designed for a rider who moves with the horse, not on top of it. But the real game-changer is the stirrups. You notice they are hung much shorter than what you're used to seeing. This allows the rider to stand up, using his knees as shock absorbers, which gives him a stable platform to hurl javelins while his horse is at a full bounding gallop. It's the difference between trying to throw a ball from a moving car seat and throwing it while standing firmly on a moving platform. The horse itself is a marvel, a lean Berber stallion that looks more like a marathon runner than a weightlifter. It's small, barely 14 hands, high but its chest is deep, and its nostrils are wide, flaring with every breath of the dry Iberian air. This is the engine of the Moorish military machine, while the Frankish destrier is a massive beast bred to carry 300 pounds of man and metal in a straight line for 300 yards. This Berber horse can go all day on a handful of barley and the occasional scrub bush. It's the ultimate off-road vehicle of the 8th century. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the term jinete actually comes from the name of a specific Berber tribe, the Zinata. They were famous across North Africa for their incredible horsemanship. Their style of riding, known as la jineta, was so effective that by the late Middle Ages, even the Christian Spanish kings would eventually force their own knights to learn it, abandoning the heavy Frankish style just to keep up. It's one of those rare moments where the conquered S culture completely rewrites the conqueror-S manual. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the riders were known to be obsessed with the dryness of their horses' limbs. They would often wrap the lower legs of their steeds in linen bandages, soaked in a concoction of egg whites and alum to stiffen the joints before a long raid. They believed this prevented the soft tissue from swelling in the heat. It's basically the medieval version of an athlete wearing compression socks. Though I'm not sure how much the horse appreciated the DIY spa treatment before a battle. Historians still argue whether the jinete style of light cavalry was a direct evolution of Numidian tactics from the Roman era, or if it was a completely new fusion of Arab speed and Berber endurance. Some believe the tactics were purely environmental, that the rocky, broken terrain of Spain simply demanded a lighter touch, while others argue it was a conscious cultural choice to reject the clunky and ungainly style of the northern barbarians. You watch as the rider checks his weapons. He doesn't carry a long, heavy lance that requires being tucked under the arm. Instead, he has several Azagias Lender javelins with fire-hardened tips or small iron heads. He can throw these with terrifying accuracy, or use them as short thrusting spears if things get personal. There's a lightness to his entire kit that makes you feel bulky and slow just by looking at him. You look down at your own gear, the heavy leather, the iron buckles, and you realize that in this environment, weight is a tax that the Moorish cavalry refuses to pay. There's a subtle humor in the way he looks at a passing Frankish prisoner's discarded helmet. He picks it up, feels the weight of the thick iron, and shakes his head with a smirk. To him, it's protective, sure, until you realize you can T-move fast enough to stop someone from just poking a knife through the eye slits while you retrying to catch your breath. The Moorish philosophy is simple. The best armor is not being where the sword lands. The rider's shield, the adarga, is leaning against a rock. You've seen these before, but never this close. It's made of multiple layers of hardened antelope or cowhide, glued and stitched together until it's as tough as plywood, but significantly lighter. It's shaped like two overlapping circles or a stylized heart. It doesn't just block a blow. Its curved surface is designed to make a spear point or a sword edge glance off. It's defensive geometry at its finest. You reach out to touch it, and the rider gives you a sharp, warning look. This isn't just equipment, it's his life insurance policy. As the rider mounts his horse, he doesn't use a mounting block or wait for a squire to help him up. He grabs the mane, puts one foot in the short stirrup, and swings up in a single fluid motion that makes you feel like an uncoordinated toddler. The horse doesn't even move, it just waits, ears flicking back, ready for the slightest pressure of the rider's knees. They operate on a frequency of communication that the Frankish knights, with their heavy bits and spurs, simply don't understand. You see the dust start to kick up as a group of riders forms a loose circle. They aren't moving in a rigid formation. They are a swarm. There's a certain terrifying beauty to it, the way they can transition from a casual trot to a full-tilt gallop in seconds. You realize that for the next few hundred years, the heavy knights of the north are going to spend a lot of time staring at the backs of these horses, wondering why they can never seem to close the distance. It's not just a difference in speed, it's a difference in how they perceive the very nature of combat. For the knight, battle is a collision. For the jinete, battle is a conversation, and they always have the last word. The sun begins to bake the ground, and you feel the sweat trickling down your spine. The jinete looks comfortable, his light robes wicking away the moisture, his horse barely breaking a sweat. You, on the other hand, are starting to feel the heavy hand of the Iberian climate. It's a silent killer, a secondary enemy that fights on the side of the light horsemen every single day. As the riders disappear into the shimmering heat haze, you are left with the metallic taste of dust in your mouth and a growing suspicion that iron might not be the strongest thing on this battlefield. You shift your weight, and the sound is like a bucket of nails being kicked down a flight of stairs. Every movement you make is a symphony of groaning iron and creaking leather. You are currently inhabiting the reality of a Carolingian-style heavy knight. And let me tell you, the glamour of chivalry is currently being smothered by about 80 pounds of hardware. Your haberka long shirt of interlocking iron rings clings to you like a cold, wet blanket made of metal. Underneath that, you're wearing a gambeson, a thick quilted tunic stuffed with wool or linen to stop the mail from bruising your ribs every time you breathe. You're essentially a human lasagna of protection, layered up and baking in the Spanish sun. You reach up to adjust your nasal helmet, a conical piece of steel with a bar protecting your nose, and you realize your peripheral vision is a suggestion at best. To see what's happening to your left or right, you have to turn your entire torso. It's like trying to navigate a supermarket while wearing a cardboard box on your head. This is the peak of Frankish military technology, the Iron Men of the North, designed to be an immovable force on a European plain. But here, in the undulating, rocky terrain of the Iberian frontier, you don't feel like an immovable force. You feel like a decorative garden gnome that someone accidentally left out in a heat wave. The weight isn't just on your shoulders, it's on your horse. Beneath you is a destrier, a massive, muscular stallion that probably eats more in a day than a small village. He's a powerhouse, bred for the shock of the charge, but you can feel his sides heaving. He's carrying you, your armor, your massive wooden shield, and your long ashwood spear. It's a staggering amount of weight for any living creature to transport across broken ground. You look at your companions, a row of steel-clad statues, and you see the same thing. The slow, heavy blinking of eyes stung by salt, the slumped shoulders of men who are losing a war against gravity. A mainstream historical fact for your mental archive. The heavy cavalry of the Franks was developed, primarily to counter the infantry-heavy armies of Northern Europe. The couched lance technique where you tuck the spear under your arm to use the momentum of the horse as a battering ram was a revolutionary bit of physics that could shatter almost any shield wall. It turned the knight into a living projectile. However, that projectile only works if the target is polite enough to stay in one place and wait to be hit. For a bit of the quirky and strange, did you know that many knights of this era would line their helmets with dried grass or even sheep esquil to act as extra padding? The problem was that in the Spanish heat, these linings became a breeding ground for lice and mites. There are accounts of knights being driven nearly insane by itching they could. Reach because they were literally bolted into their gear. Imagine trying to keep your dignity while your head feels like an ant farm. It's the kind of detail that tapestries always seem to leave out. Historians still argue whether the Frankish insistence on heavy armor in the Mediterranean was a sign of tactical stubbornness or a necessary adaptation to protect against the sheer volume of projectiles the Moors threw at them. Some argue that without the mail, the Franks would have been picked apart in days. Others suggest the weight itself was what led to their eventual exhaustion and defeat in the long skirmish. Wars of the 8th and 9th centuries, you try to spur your horse forward, but the ground is soft and sandy here. His hooves sink in, and the effort to pull them out drains his energy with every step. You look ahead and see a line of Moorish riders. They aren't charging, they're just sitting there. They're watching you. They look like they're having a picnic compared to your current state of misery. You know that as soon as you commit to a gallop, they will simply trot 20 yards back. You'll be 500 calories poorer, and they'll be exactly where they started, probably sharing a joke about how your helmet makes you look like a very angry metal bird. There is a fundamental mismatch in the physics of this engagement. You are built for a single, decisive, momentary crash of impact. If you hit them, you win. They know this. Therefore, they have made it their life's mission to never, ever let you hit them. It's a psychological grind. You want a climax, they want a marathon. You want to settle this with a roar and a strike. They want to settle it by watching you slowly turn into a giant, sweaty raisin inside your iron shell. You find yourself resenting the very armor that's supposed to be keeping you alive. You look down at your hands, encased in leather gloves. They're trembling slightly from the strain of holding your heavy kite shield steady. The shield is beautiful, painted with your family's crest, but it catches the wind like a sail and drags on your arm like a lead weight. You realize that your entire martial identity is based on the idea of being unbreakable. But in this heat, under this sun, unbreakable feels a lot like immobile. You are a fortress, but a fortress that can't move is just a very expensive prison. The heavy knight was the billionaire of the medieval battlefield, high maintenance, incredibly expensive, and requiring a massive support staff just to function. You need squires to help you mount, blacksmiths to fix your links, and a supply chain of high-quality grain for your horse. As you squint through the dust at the Moorish riders who seem to be living off the land and riding horses that could probably survive on a diet of spite and mountain air, the economic reality of the war starts to sink in. You're playing an expensive game, and the house the environment is rigged against you. You hear a whistle, and a javelin clangs off your shoulder. The mail does its job. The point doesn't penetrate, but the force of it jars your arm, and the realization that they can hit you whenever they want, while you can only hit them if they allow it, is demoralizing. You're a shark in a world that's suddenly turned into a desert. You have the teeth, you have the power, but you're thrashing in the sand while the seagulls circle above, waiting for you to stop moving. As the order comes to advance, you feel your horse bunch his muscles. You let out a breath, feeling the hot metal of the nasal bar against your lip. This is it, the big push. But as you start the heavy, thunderous roll of the charge, you already see the Moorish light cavalry beginning to drift away like smoke. They aren't even running, they're just repositioning. You are a sledgehammer swinging at a ghost, and the momentum of your own weight is starting to feel like your biggest enemy. You wipe a smear of grime from your eyes and look out over the horizon. The landscape of central Iberia, the Meseta, is a punishing expanse of red clay, scrub brush, and rock. It isn't the lush, emerald-green pastureland of the Frankish heartlands. Here, the grass doesn't grow thick and sweet. It grows in yellowed patches that look like they've already surrendered to the sun. This is the fourth section of our journey, and we're re-looking at the logistical nightmare that turned the Frankish heavy knight into a starving giant. You realize that an army travels on its stomach, but a heavy cavalry army travels on the stomach of its horses, and your horse is currently looking at a patch of dry thistle with deep, profound sadness. The logistical math of medieval warfare is brutal. Your destrier, that magnificent beast of war, requires about 15 to 25 pounds of quality forage and grain every single day to maintain the muscle mass needed to carry you in full kit. In the fertile valleys of the Rhine or the Seine, that's an easy ask. In the arid interior of the Iberian Peninsula, it's a death sentence. You're watching the supply wagons fall further and further behind. The oxen pulling them are dying of thirst, and the heavy wooden wheels are cracking in the dry heat. Without those wagons, your horse starts to waste away. You can see his ribs beginning to trace lines against his hide, and the power in his gallop is being replaced by a stumbling, desperate trot. Meanwhile, you look at the Moorish camp across the ravine. Their horses, the Berbers and Arabians, are smaller, yes, but they are built for this. They are the camels of the equine world. They can survive on the tough, scrubby vegetation that your European horse finds indigestible. They require less water, and more importantly, they can handle the alkaline, salty water sources that give your horse colic. You're witnessing a biological war of attrition. The Moorish cavalry isn't just outmaneuvering you on the field. They're out-aiding you. They are sustainable. You are an ecological disaster, a mainstream historical fact. The scorched earth policy was the primary defensive strategy of the Iberian borders, known as the Duero Desert, to prevent the heavy Frankish and Visigothic armies from advancing. The Moorish governors, and later the Christian kings in reverse, would systematically destroy crops, fill in wells with stones, and burn granaries for miles. For a light cavalry force that can travel 40 miles a day, this is a hurdle. For a heavy cavalry force that can barely manage 15 miles before the horses give out, it's a total blockade. For a quirky fringe tidbit, during long campaigns in these dry zones, Frankish knights were sometimes forced to feed their horses a mixture of wine and soaked bread when water ran out. While it sounds like a weirdly sophisticated way to die, the alcohol actually dehydrated the horses faster and made them uncoordinated. There are surviving accounts of drunken cavalry charges where the horses simply wandered off course or fell over. Imagine being a highborn noble, polished in iron, only for your horse to get a buzz and decide the battle is actually taking place inside a nearby hedge. Historians still argue whether the extreme desertification of the Duero region in the 8th century was a deliberate man-made military buffer or a natural climatic shift that the Moors simply exploited. Some call it the Desert of the Duero, a massive no-man's land where nothing could grow and no large army could survive. Whether by design or by nature, this wasteland became the ultimate shield for the Umayyad Caliphate against the heavy-hitting northerners. You feel the weight of your own hunger now. You're eating hardtack and rancid lard, and your stomach is in constant revolt. The Moorish soldiers, however, are often seen carrying small pouches of dried dates, figs, and toasted barley energy, lightweight rations that don't require a slow-moving kitchen wagon. They can strike a village, take what they need, and vanish before your scouts even report their presence. You are a predator that needs a 5-course meal to hunt. They are the predators that can live on the scent of the wind. The heat isn't just an inconvenience, it's a physical force. You see the shimmer of a mirage on the road ahead. It looks like a lake, but you know it's just the sun playing tricks on your desperate mind. Your armor has become a heat sink. It absorbs the thermal energy of the sun and traps it against your body. You are literally being steamed in your own sweat. You look at your lance, the wood parched and prone to splintering in this humidity-free air. Everything about your equipment assumes a temperate climate that simply doesn't exist here. You think back to the stories of the Great Crusades or the battles in Gaul, where the heavy charge broke the enemy in minutes. Here, The battle has been going on for 3 weeks, and you haven't even seen the enemy's face. You've just seen the dust clouds they leave behind as they move from well to well, always one step ahead. They aren't fighting your army, they're fighting your metabolism. They know that if they wait long enough, the sun and the lack of grain will do the work of 1,000 swords. There's a specific kind of bitterness that sets in when you realize your superior technology is actually a leash. You are tied to the supply lines. You are tied to the riverbeds. You are tied to the few fertile patches of land. The Moorish light cavalry is free. They move like water over the landscape, filling the gaps you leave behind and retreating where you push. You realize that in Iberian warfare, the map is a weapon, and the Moors are the only ones who know how to wield it. You watch a small group of jinetes crest a hill a mile away. They aren't even galloping. They're just watching you suffer. One of them raises a water skin, drinks deeply, and then pours the rest on the ground in a gesture of pure, agonizing defiance. It's a joke, a light-hearted jab at your thirst, but it stings more than a physical wound. They have the luxury of wasting water. You are at the point where you de-trade your family crest for a cup of lukewarm mud. As you signal your men to keep moving, you can hear the clank of their armor sounding duller, heavier, and more like a funeral dirge with every passing mile. You're riding in the middle of a dense Frankish column, the dust kicked up by the horses in front of you coating your throat in a fine, chalky grit. Suddenly, the cry goes up, the enemy. On the horizon, a swarm of Moorish light cavalry appears, their robes billowing like white sails against the ochre earth. Your commander, a hot-blooded count from the Pyrenees, sees his chance for glory. He lowers his visor, signals the trumpeter, and the heavy line begins to accelerate. This is what you've been waiting for. The thud-thud-thud of 1,000 destriers hits a crescendo, a terrifying wall of iron hurtling toward the lighter-moored heathens. You feel that surge of adrenaline, the conviction that nothing can stand before this weight. And then, just as the gap closes to 50 yards, the impossible happens. The Moorish line doesn't brace for impact. They don't scream a final defiance, they simply turn, in a maneuver so fluid it looks rehearsed by a troupe of dancers. The entire formation wheels their horses 180 degrees and begins to gallop away. You hear your commander scream, "Cowards!" and the pursuit is on. But as you chase them, your heavy horse is working twice as hard to maintain the pace. The Moors stay just out of reach, occasionally glancing back over their shoulders. This is the tornandira, the most frustrating and lethal tactic in the Iberian playbook. It's the turn and flee, and you've just bitten the hook. As you gallop, the tight, disciplined line of your heavy cavalry starts to fray. The faster horses pull ahead, the tired ones lag behind. Your wall of iron is now a disorganized string of individuals. Suddenly, the Moorish riders hear a signal, perhaps a sharp whistle, or a specific beat on a small drum. In the blink of an eye, they wheel back around. They aren't fleeing anymore. They are charging back into the gaps of your broken line, hitting your horses in the flanks while you still trying to slow down from your own momentum. They've turned your own speed against you, and now you're fighting a dozen individual duels instead of one grand battle. A mainstream historical fact, the tornandira or tornifuge was so deeply ingrained in the warfare of the Reconquista that it became the defining tactical difference between the Crusades in the Levant and the wars in Spain. In the Holy Land, the heavy charge often worked because the terrain was more open. In the broken hilly terrain of Iberia, the tornandira allowed the Moors to lead heavy knights into rocky ravines or sandy traps where their horses would stumble, making them easy prey for a counterstrike, for something quirky and a bit French. The Moors actually used their horses' tails as a tactical signal. There are obscure mentions that certain units would braid bright ribbons or even bells into the horses' tails, and the way the horse tail swished at a gallop would signal to the rider behind them whether to keep the pace or prepare for the turn. It's essentially a biological blinker system for a cavalry formation. If you saw the bells swinging in a certain rhythm, you knew the trap was about to spring. Historians still argue whether the tornandira was a purely indigenous Berber tactic or if it was a sophisticated adaptation of the Parthian shot used by eastern steppe nomads. Some scholars believe the Berbers perfected it independently as a response to the Roman legions centuries earlier, while others argue that the Arab conquest brought the feigned retreat from the deserts of the Levant and merged it with the specific agility of the Iberian-bred horse. You find yourself in the middle of the chaos now. You've overextended. Your horse is blown, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. A Moorish rider, the same one you were chasing 5 minutes ago, is now circling you. He's not trying to hit your armor. He's aiming for your horse's neck with a short, wicked spear. You swing your broadsword, but he's already moved. It's like trying to fight a ghost with a sledgehammer. Every time you commit to a swing, he's gone, and the weight of your armor pulls you off balance. You realize that the retreat wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a vacuum designed to suck you in and tear you apart. The sheer psychological exhaustion of this is worse than the physical. You want a fight that makes sense. You want the enemy to stand their ground so you can prove your valor. But the Moorish riders don't care about your valor. They care about the fact that you re-sweating through your gambeson and your horse is about to collapse. They are playing a game of patience, and you are losing your mind. You start to see why the Frankish chronicles often describe the Moors as slippery or deceitful. It's not that they're lying, it's that they're refusing to play a game where you have all the advantages. You manage to parry a javelin with your shield, the impact vibrating up your arm. You look around and see your commander, the proud count, being pulled from his horse. He wasn't killed by a glorious lance thrust. He was simply exhausted, and 3 riders closed in once his horse tripped in a rabbit hole. This is the reality of the tornandira. It doesn't kill you with a blow. It kills you with 1,000 small mistakes made under pressure. It's a death by 1,000 cuts, delivered at 40 miles per hour. As the sun continues to beat down, you realize the Moors are withdrawing again. They aren't finishing the job, not yet. They're going to let you regroup, let you think you've escaped, and then they'll do it all over again in 2 hours. They are treating your army like a wounded bull in an arena, tiring you out until you can't even lift your head. You realize that outmaneuvering isn't just about moving faster. It's about controlling the tempo of the entire day. They decide when the fight starts, they decide when it pauses, and they will certainly be the ones to decide when it ends. You pull your horse into a shaky halt and wipe the grime from your visor. Your heart is pounding against your ribs, not from courage, but from the sheer, myocide terrifying realization that you are completely out of your element. You are a heavyweight boxer in a ring with a world-class fencer, and the fencer has decided that the ring is the size of a football field. As you look at the white robes of the enemy shimmering in the distance, you feel a cold shiver despite the heat. You aren't just fighting men. You're fighting a system of war that has no room for your ironclad pride. You find yourself standing within the cool limestone walls of the royal stables in Cordoba, a sharp and welcome contrast to the blinding glare of the Meseta. The air here smells of sweet hay, expensive leather, and the earthy musk of high-performance animals. You aren't looking at the massive, thick-boned destriers of the north, those great horses that look like they could pull a plow if they were uncarrying a knight. No, before you stands the biological masterpiece of Al-Andalus, the refined Iberian-Arabian cross. You reach out to stroke the neck of a bay stallion, and his skin feels like warm silk over tempered steel. This horse isn't just an animal, it's a technological edge that the Franks simply cannot replicate. The secret to Moorish maneuvering lies in the selective breeding programs managed by the Umayyad caliphs and later the Tifa kings. While the rest of Europe was breeding for size and raw power to support the increasing weight of male armor, the Moors were obsessed with dryness, the absence of excess fat and heavy bone. They introduced the blood of the desert-born Arabian horse to the local Iberian stock. The result was a horse with the explosive speed and lung capacity of the Arab, but the sturdy, Baroque agility of the native Spanish breeds. This horse can stop on a dime, pivot on its haunches, and accelerate to a full gallop in 3 strides. It's the difference between driving a heavy-duty truck and a finely tuned Italian sports car. You watch as a stable hand leads the stallion out for exercise. The horse moves with a high-stepping, elastic gait. In the north, horses are often kept in damp, dark stables and fed on whatever forage is available. Here, the diet is a science. These horses are fed on high-protein barley and alfalfa, often supplemented with honey or dates to give them a quick burst of glucose before a skirmish. You're seeing the result of centuries of nomadic wisdom translated into a sedentary, royal institution. The Moors understood that the horse's spirit was as important as its legs. They treated their mounts as partners, often sharing their own tents or waterskins with them during desert crossings, a mainstream historical fact. The introduction of these eastern bloodlines into the Iberian Peninsula eventually created the Andalusian horse, which would become the most sought-after breed in the world for centuries. These horses were so prized for their high-schooled movements, the ability to leap, kick, and dance in combat, that they were considered a strategic resource, much like oil is today. Exporting a top-tier stallion to a Christian kingdom was often treated as an act of high treason. For a quirky fringe tidbit, some Moorish veterinary manuals from the 10th century suggest that a horse's temperament could be improved by playing specific rhythms on a lute or a drum during feeding. They believed that music could sync the horse's heartbeat with the rider's intent. There are even accounts of war music specifically composed to keep horses calm during the chaos of a tornandira maneuver. Imagine a cavalry unit charging at you while their horses are vibing to a medieval Laffy beat. It sounds ridiculous until you realize how calm and collected these animals remain while javelins are flying past their ears. Historians still argue whether the legendary desert endurance of the Moorish horse was a product of superior genetics or simply a result of the harsh survival of the fittest training methods used by the Berber tribes. Some argue that the Berber horses were naturally adapted to low-water environments, while others suggest that the Moorish riders simply had a much higher tolerance for pushing their animals to the absolute brink of death. A cultural difference in the utility of the animal compared to the Frankish view of the horse as a noble long-term investment. You watch the rider mount up using those short stirrups we talked about earlier. He sits into the horse, his weight distributed in a way that doesn't strain the animal's spine. This allows the horse to stay fresh for hours longer than a knight's mount. You'll realize that the Frankish knight is a 100-meter sprinter, while the Moorish jinete is a mountain marathon runner. In the long, grueling campaigns of the Reconquista, where you might have to ride for 3 days just to find a reliable well, the marathon runner wins every single time. There's a subtle irony in the way the Moorish nobility views the European destrier. To them, the Frankish horse is a beast of burden that happens to have a man on its back. They see the heavy clumping hooves and the slow lumbering turns as a lack of refinement. In the refined courts of Seville or Granada, a man's status isn't just measured by the gold on his hilt, but by the breath of his horse, how quickly the animal recovers after a sprint. If your horse is still huffing 10 minutes after a charge, you are seen as an amateur who doesn't understand the art of the horse. As you exit the stables, the heat hits you again, but you look at the horses in the paddock with a new sense of respect. They aren't just animals, they are the literal foundation of the caliphate's power. Without this specific combination of Arabian lungs, Berber hooves, and Iberian brains, the light cavalry tactics would be impossible. You could give a Frankish knight a javelin and tell him to turn and flee, but his horse would likely trip over its own heavy feet or blow a lung trying to keep up. The Moors didn't just outthink the Franks, they outbred them. They recognized that the environment of the peninsula was a filter, and they designed a living tool that could pass through that filter with ease. As the sun sets, casting long shadows across the stable yard, you realize that the clatter of those light, nimble hooves is the sound of a superpower. The heavy knights of the north are coming with iron and fire, but the Moors are waiting with something much more resilient. A lineage of speed that has been tempered in the fires of the Sahara and the rocky heights of the Atlas Mountains. You are standing at the mouth of a jagged mountain pass in the Sierra Morena, and suddenly, the world feels very, very small. To your left and right, walls of gray slate and sun-bleached granite rise up like the teeth of some subterranean giant. The path beneath your horse's hooves isn't a road. It's a treacherous ribbon of loose shale and sun-cracked clay. This is the terrain that acts as the Moorish light cavalry's greatest force multiplier. For a Frankish knight, this landscape is a nightmare. You can feel your heavy destrier shivering under you. He wasn't built for mountain climbing. His massive hooves, designed to thunder across the loamy soil of Flanders, find no purchase here. Every slip sends a jolt of panic through his heavy frame, and you realize that if he goes down, your 80 pounds of armor will ensure you don't just fall, you'll plummet like an iron anvil. The Moors, however, move through this vertical labyrinth with a terrifying nonchalance. You see a group of jinetes cresting a ridge above you that looks nearly perpendicular. Their smaller Berber horses have lower centers of gravity and hooves that are hard and dense, almost like goat hooves. They don't need a paved Roman road to make a flanking maneuver. They use the goat paths and the dry arroyos to disappear from your front and reappear on your flank. In this broken terrain, the very concept of a battle line evaporates. You aren't fighting in a field. You're refighting in a maze where the walls are made of stone and the floor is a trap. As you struggle to maintain your balance, you realize the tactical genius of the Moorish defensive strategy. They don't meet you on the plains if they can help it. They draw you into the Sierras, the saw-toothed mountains. Here, your most powerful weapon, the couched lance charge, is physically impossible. You can't get up to speed. You can't maintain a cohesive formation. You're reduced to a slow, stumbling crawl. The Moors, meanwhile, lean out from their saddles, using the elevation to rain down javelins. Gravity is free, and they reusing it to turn every small spear into a deadly projectile that gains momentum as it whistles toward your exposed neck. A mainstream historical fact for you: the geography of the Iberian Peninsula is more mountainous than almost any other part of Western Europe, second only to Switzerland in its average elevation. This meant that for centuries, the frontier of the Duero was less a line on a map and more a series of fortified mountain passes. If you controlled the heights, you controlled the flow of the war. The Moors mastered the art of the embuscada, the ambush using the terrain to negate the numerical and metallic superiority of the Northern Crusaders. For a quirky and slightly fringe detail, there are legends of Moorish scouts who would actually shoe their horses with braided esparto grass or leather wrappings when navigating particularly slick, rocky slopes. The idea was to dampen the sound of the hooves against the stone for a midnight raid and to provide a grip that iron shoes could unoffer on wet slate. It's essentially the 10th century equivalent of putting snow chains on a jeep. Imagine the silence of 100 horses moving over stone like cats. The only sound, the faint rustle of grass against rock. Historians still argue whether the heavy knight's failure in the mountains was a result of the horses, physical limitations, or the knight's own psychological refusal to dismount. There's a long-standing debate about the cult of the saddle. The idea that a noble felt it was beneath his dignity to fight on foot, even when the terrain made staying mounted a death sentence. Some argue that the Moors were far more pragmatic warriors, willing to scramble up a cliffside on all fours if it meant getting the drop on an enemy. You look up, squinting against the sun, and see a flash of a white turban behind a boulder. Before you can even shout a warning, a volley of arrows and javelins descends. You try to raise your kite shield, but it's awkward in the narrow pass. The shield bangs against the rock wall, jarring your shoulder. Your horse rears back, his iron-shod hooves sparking against the granite. It's a chaotic, noisy mess. The Moors don't even stay to see the results. By the time you've steadied your mount, they've already vanished over the next ridge, using their knowledge of the hidden valleys to relocate before you can retaliate. This is the War of the Sierras. It's a war of nerves. You spend all day looking up, your neck aching from the weight of your helmet, waiting for a threat you can't reach. Every rustle of a bush, every rolling pebble, feels like the start of an attack. The environment is doing half the work for the Moorish cavalry. They aren't just outmaneuvering your body, they're outmaneuvering your sanity. You feel like a giant in a crawlspace, powerful but claustrophobic, while the small men dance in the rafters above you. As the sun begins to set, the shadows in the canyon stretch out like long, dark fingers. The temperature drops rapidly. The high desert climate of the mountains is as fickle as the terrain. You're shivering now, your sweat-soaked gambeson turning into a cold, damp rag. You realize that to survive here, you have to stop thinking like a conqueror and start thinking like a mountain goat. But your armor, your tradition, and your massive horse won't let you. You are a product of the plains, trapped in a world of peaks, and the Moorish riders know exactly how to use those peaks to bury you. You see a narrow trail branching off the main path, leading toward a hidden spring. Your scouts tell you it's a shortcut, but you hesitate. Is it a shortcut, or is it a funnel? In the mountains of Al-Andalus, every choice is a tactical gamble. The light cavalry doesn't just ride the terrain, they inhabit it. They know which rocks will hold a horse's weight and which will crumble into a landslide. As you signal your weary men to make camp in a cramped, indefensible gully, you can shake the feeling that you're being watched by 1,000 eyes from the heights above. Eyes that are untired, aren't heavy, and are perfectly comfortable in the vertical world. You're sitting atop your horse, staring into the shimmering heat haze of the Meseta, and you're starting to feel like you're losing your mind. For 3 hours, you've been in combat, yet you haven't swung your sword once. This is the psychological warfare of the shadow boxer. To your front, about 100 yards away, a group of Moorish riders is circling. They aren't attacking, they're just existing. They move in a loose hypnotic loop, their white robes snapping in the wind. Every few minutes, one of them breaks the loop, gallops toward you, screams an insult in a language you don't understand, and hurls a javelin. You lift your shield, You hear the clack of wood on leather, and then the rider is gone, back into the safety of the circle before you can even spur your horse into a trot. This is the psychological tax of fighting the jinete. Yet, in the Frankish world, battle is a release of tension. You charge, you hit, the tension breaks, and someone dies. It's binary. But here, the tension never breaks. It just stretches. Your nerves are frayed like an old rope. You're waiting for the real fight to start, but the Moors have decided that this is the real fight. They are content to hover on the edge of your vision like a persistent migraine. You feel the heavy weight of your broadsword hanging from your belt-a-weapon designed to cleave through mainland. You realize it? Useless against an enemy that refuses to be a solid object. A mainstream historical fact, this style of harassment warfare was a key component of the Guerra de Bandos that defined the Iberian frontier for centuries. It wasn't about capturing territory in a single day. It was about breaking the enemy's will to remain in the field. By refusing to engage in a traditional pitched battle, the Moorish forces could keep a much larger, more expensive heavy cavalry force pinned down and miserable for weeks until the soldiers simply deserted or the horses died of exhaustion. For a quirky fringe tidbit, some contemporary accounts mention that Moorish skirmishers would sometimes paint eyes on the rumps of their horses or wear masks on the backs of their heads. The psychological theory bordering on the occult to the superstitious. Frankish mind was that the enemy would feel they were always being watched, even as the Moors retreated. It's a primitive form of psychological gaslighting. You can never sneak up on them, and they are always looking at you, even when they're running away. It adds a layer of eerie supernatural dread to an already exhausting day. Historians still argue whether the Knights' Rage, the tendency for European nobles to break formation in a suicidal solo charge, was a failure of discipline or a calculated response to this psychological pressure. Some scholars suggest that the knights weren't just being hot-headed. They were literally trying to force a conclusion to a situation they found mentally unbearable. They would rather die in a blaze of glory than spend another 6 hours being poked by javelins while sitting in their own sweat. You see it happen now. To your left, a young knight, probably on his first campaign, can't take it anymore. He lets out a roar, digs his spurs into his horse's flanks, and charges the circle of light cavalry alone. You want to yell for him to stop, but your throat is too dry. You watch the Moorish circle simply open up like a closing eye. They let him fly through the middle, then they close the gap behind him. Now he's in the center of their loop. He's swinging his sword at the air, his horse spinning in circles, while the jinetes take turns darting in to jab at his horse's legs. Within 2 minutes, he's on the ground. And the Moorish riders have returned to their original positions, looking like they barely broke a sweat. The silence that follows is heavier than the noise. The shadow has returned. You look at your men, and you see the hollow eyes. They are terrified, not of death, but of this endless, repetitive nothingness. The Moorish riders are now performing a fantasia showing off their horsemanship, standing on their saddles, or tossing their spears into the air and catching them. It's a taunt. They are showing you that they are comfortable, that they are having fun, while you are slowly being cooked alive in a metal suit. This constant state of almost fighting triggers a physiological response. Your adrenaline spikes, then dips, then spikes again. By noon, you're more exhausted than if you'd fought a 3-hour melee. Your grip on your lance is shaky because your muscles have been tensed for a blow that never comes. You're experiencing the 1,000-yard stare of the 11th century. The Moors aren't just outmaneuvering your horses. They are outmaneuvering your central nervous system. They are the masters of the empty battlefield. You realize that your entire military education has left you completely unprepared for this. You were taught how to strike a shield, how to hold a line, how to honor a challenge. You were untaught how to handle a man who throws a stick at you and then hides behind a cloud of dust. There is no honor in this for you, only a growing sense of humiliation. You feel like a bull in a ring, frustrated and bleeding from a dozen small darts, while the matador dances just out of reach, waiting for your heart to give out. As the afternoon shadows grow longer, the Moorish riders finally begin to pull back into the hills. They don't leave all at once. They fade away one by one until the horizon is empty. You should feel relieved, but you don't. You know they're still there, just beyond the next ridge, waiting for the moon to rise. They've spent the day living in your head, and now they're leaving you with the bill. You look down at your hands and realize you've been gripping your reins so hard your knuckles are white. You've survived the day's battle, but you feel like you've lost something far more important than a piece of ground. The sun is a physical weight now, pressing down on your shoulders as if trying to fold you into the dry Iberian crust. You reach for the wooden canteen hanging from your saddle, but it's light, terrifyingly light. When you pull the cork, you're met with a tepid, vinegary liquid that tastes more like a wet-wooled blanket than water. This is the biological reality of the frontier. You're a Frankish knight, and your body is currently a failing cooling system. Between the quilted gambeson and the iron mail, you are essentially a walking sous-vide experiment. Your core temperature is climbing, and your brain is starting to feel like it's floating in a bowl of warm soup. Across the valley, you watch a Moorish scout. He's dressed in layers of light, breathable linen and cotton fabrics that facilitate evaporative cooling. He isn't chugging water, he's sipping it sparingly from a goatskin odor. The Moors bring a North African desert survival culture to the battlefield that makes your Northern European habits look suicidal. While your lords are calling for wine, which only accelerates dehydration and makes you clumsy though. Moorish troops are often seen chewing on bitter herbs or small pieces of dried fruit to stimulate saliva. They aren't just fighting you, they are outliving you in a climate that views your heavy equipment as a death warrant. A mainstream historical fact, heatstroke was arguably a more prolific killer than the sword. During the summer campaigns of the Reconquista, during the infamous summer raids or Acifas, Christian armies often lost a significant percentage of their force to the fire of the blood, as they called it, before they even engaged the enemy. The Moors specifically timed their maneuvers to keep the heavy cavalry moving during the hottest part of the day, knowing that the thermal mass of the knight's armor would eventually lead to a total physiological collapse. For a quirky fringe tidbit, there are accounts of Moorish soldiers using a technique called the cool breath, where they would wrap their heads in turbans soaked in rosewater or diluted vinegar. As the wind blew through the damp fabric, it created a localized air conditioning effect for the head and neck. Meanwhile, some Frankish knights, desperate for relief, were known to pour water directly into their mail shirts. This was a catastrophic mistake. The water would trap heat and turn the padding underneath into a steaming bacterial mess that caused armor gala painful, blistering skin infection that could turn septic in the heat. Historians still argue whether the prohibition of wine in the Moorish camps provided a genuine tactical advantage, or if it was more of a moral-boosting myth. Some argue that the lack of alcohol kept the light cavalry disciplined and hydrated, while others point out that many Tefera Moorish soldiers, especially the palace guards, were known to enjoy the local Iberian vineyards just as much as their Christian counterparts. However, the official military doctrine of the Almoravids and Almohads was strictly ascetic, emphasizing water and sour milk as the fuel of the holy warrior. You feel your horse stumble. He est thumping, a dangerous condition where a horse's diaphragm mimics its heartbeat due to electrolyte loss. You realize with a jolt of fear that if he goes down, you are an overturned turtle in a desert full of crows. You look at the jinetes circling in the distance. They look so comfortable. Their horses aren't foaming at the mouth. Their riders aren't slumped over their pummels. They've turned the climate into an auxiliary wing of their army. They don't need to charge you. They just need to wait for the sun to finish what it started at dawn. The irony isn't lost on you. Your wealth and status allowed you to buy the best protection money can provide. The thickest mail, the largest horse, the sturdiest shield. But in this environment, your wealth is a lead weight, dragging you into the grave. The poor Berber, with his single tunic and a skin of water, is the one who truly owns the landscape. You are a tourist in a hellscape, and you've brought all the wrong luggage. As you watch your commander wipe a layer of salt from his eyebrows, you see a look of pure, unadulterated misery in his eyes. The Grand Crusade has been reduced to a desperate search for a shaded tree and a well that has been poisoned with a dead sheep. The Moorish light cavalry knows where every spring is hidden in these parched hills. They move from oasis to oasis, staying fresh while they lead you on a zigzagging chase through the driest patches of the Meseta. It's a masterful use of logistics as a weapon of terror. The day ends, not with a clash of steel, but with a whimper of thirst. As the first stars begin to poke through the purple sky, you finally reach a muddy creek. You don't even wait to take off your helmet. You drop to your knees and shove your face into the silt. It's warm, it's dirty, and it's the most beautiful thing you've ever tasted. But even as you drink, you hear the distant, mocking sound of a flute from the Moorish camp on the hill above. They aren't thirsty. They've been hydrated all day, watching you turn into a husk. You realize that tomorrow, the cycle starts again, and you're already starting at a deficit. You are sitting by a small, crackling fire, the blue hour of the Iberian dusk turning the surrounding cork trees into twisted silhouettes. Across your knees lies a curious object you scavenged from a fallen Moorish scout. It's an al-karr. To your Frankish eyes, accustomed to the heavy kite-shaped shields of the North's massive wooden slabs, reinforced with iron rims, this thing looks like a toy. It's shaped like two overlapping circles, or perhaps a heart, and it's surprisingly light. You pick it up, expecting the heft of oak, but it feels more like a thick book. This is the defensive soul of the jinete, and as you run your fingers over its surface, you begin to understand why your broadsword kept bouncing off it earlier today. The al-karr is a masterpiece of material science. It isn't made of wood, which can split under a heavy blow, or metal, which is heavy and can dent. Instead, it's constructed from multiple layers of hardened hide, usually from the North African antelope known as the oryx, or sometimes from the thickest parts of a bull skin. These layers are glued together with a powerful animal-based adhesive and then stitched with sinew. The result is a shield that is elastic in its defense. When your heavy sword hits it, the leather doesn't break. It flexes, absorbing the kinetic energy and redirecting the force. It's the medieval equivalent of Cavalry. You notice the way the edges are beveled, and the surface is slightly convex. This isn't an accident. A spear point hitting this surface at an angle won't bite into the grain of wood. It will skip off the slick, hardened leather. You try to imagine holding this while riding at a full gallop. Because it's so light, a rider can shift it from his chest to his back or over his horse's neck in a fraction of a second. It's an active defense. Unlike your kite shield, which is a passive wall you mostly just hide behind, the al-karr is part of the rider's movement, a parrying tool that allows him to stay nimble while remaining protected. A mainstream historical fact, the al-karr was so effective that it survived long after the advent of gunpowder. While the heavy shields of European knights were discarded as they became useless against firearms, the al-karr remained in the Spanish military kit well into the 16th century. It even made its way to the New World, where Spanish soldiers used these same leather shields to deflect the obsidian-tipped arrows of Aztec and Mayan warriors. It is one of the longest-lived pieces of defensive technology in human history. For a quirky fringe tidbit, according to some 12th century military life hacks, Moorish soldiers would often rub their al-karrs with a mixture of animal fat and garlic. The fat kept the leather from becoming brittle in the dry heat, but the garlic, that was psychological. They believed the pungent smell would confuse the enemy's horses during a close-quarters melee. Imagine a cavalry charge where the air suddenly smells like a very aggressive Italian kitchen. It's the kind of sensory overload that could give a rider just enough of an edge to land a killing blow. Historians still argue whether the al-karr was a direct descendant of the small, round Ketra shields used by the ancient Iberian tribes who fought Hannibal, or if it was brought over entirely by the Berber tribes during the initial 711 invasion. Some see it as a perfect synthesis in North African material, oryx hide, applied to an indigenous Iberian shape to create a weapon that was perfectly suited for the specific skirmish and retreat warfare of the peninsula. You stand up and try to mimic the stance of a jinete. You hold the leather strap and realize that the handle is positioned to allow the shield to be gripped in multiple ways. You can hold it tight to your forearm for a solid block, or you can hold it by a single strap to flick a javelin away. You look at your own shield, leaning against a triad S, already showing a deep crack from a single axe blow. Your superior European equipment is failing you because it was designed for a world of static lines and heavy impacts. The al-karr was designed for a world of motion. There's a gentle irony in the fact that your own armorers will eventually copy this design. Within a century, the Christian knights of the North will realize that they can win the war if they count move, and the heart-shaped leather shield will become a common sight in the armies of Castile and Aragon. You're holding the future of Iberian warfare in your hands, but right now, it just feels like another reminder of how much you have to learn. You are a man of iron in a world that is quickly turning to leather. As the fire dies down, you lay the al-karr back on the ground. It feels strangely warm to the touch, almost as if it's still part of a living thing. You think about the man who carried it, how he moved with his horse as if they shared a single nervous system. He didn't need a wall to hide behind because he was never where the blow landed. He used this shield not to stop the war, but to keep the conversation of battle moving in his favor. You close your eyes, and the image of that shifting, heart-shaped silhouette haunts your sleep, a symbol of a speed you can't yet match. You're crouched in a thicket of dry lavender, the scent overwhelming your senses as you watch a figure move through the valley below. This isn't a knight or a glorious sultan. It's a Mudayar scout, a local who lives in the shifting gray zone between the Christian north and the Islamic south. He's dressed in nondescript browns and grays, looking more like a shepherd than a soldier, but he is the eyes and ears of the Moorish light cavalry. You realize that the Franks aren't just being outpaced, they are being outsmarted because they are fighting on a map they don't understand. To you, this valley is just a valley. To the scout, it's a network of hidden paths and dry wells that can swallow an entire battalion. The Moorish intelligence network was a sophisticated machine, while the Frankish commanders relied on rigid traditional routes. Roman roads and well-known mountain passes. The Moors utilized a deep ancestral knowledge of the land. They employed mozarabs and local peasants who knew which streams would be dry by July and which caves could hide 500 horses from the midday sun. This wasn't just scouting, it was environmental mastery. You're witnessing the precursor to modern guerrilla intelligence. Every time you think you've found a secure campsite, a Mudayar scout has already signaled your position using a mirror or a specific pattern of smoke. This informational advantage allowed the light cavalry to be proactive rather than reactive. They didn't have to wander aimlessly looking for you. They knew exactly where your heavy, lumbering baggage train was at all times. They knew your horses were thirsty before you did. You feel a prickle of unease on the back of your neck. It's the realization that you are being processed by a military system that treats the landscape as a living document. You are the only one in this valley who is truly lost, despite having a compass and a royal commission, a mainstream historical fact. The term Mudayar refers to Muslims who remained in Christian-conquered territories. But during the centuries of fluid borders, these populations, along with Mozarab's Christians living under Muslim rule, acted as a massive, informal intelligence web. They often shared more culturally with their neighbors across the border than with the distant kings in Paris or Damascus. This frontier culture meant that secrets leaked like a sieve, and the light cavalry, with their extreme mobility, were the ones best positioned to act on that leaked data within hours. For a quirky, fringe tidbit, there are accounts of Moorish intelligence officers using pigeon post as early as the 10th century while the Franks were sending riders on horseback who could be captured or killed. The Moors were sending messages over the heads of the enemy at 60 miles per hour. Some legends even claim they would dye the pigeons' wings different colors to represent the urgency or the nature of the message. Red for an incoming invasion, blue for a successful raid. You're literally being outpaced by a bird. Historians still argue whether the treachery often cited in Christian chronicles, where local guides would lead heavy cavalry into dead-end canyons, was a result of active sabotage or simply the inherent difficulty of translating local geography to foreign ears. Some argue that the Moors ran a deliberate misinformation campaign, planting false scouts in the paths of advancing Frankish armies to lead them toward the driest, most grueling terrain possible, to soften them up for a jinete strike. You watch the scout below as he stops to inspect the tracks left by your column. He doesn't just see hoofprints, he sees the depth of the impression, telling him exactly how heavy your knights are and how tired the horses must be. He notes the lack of manure, a sign of your dwindling forage. He's reading your army's health like a doctor. To the Moorish high command, your army isn't a threat. It's a predictable set of data points, moving slowly across a grid. They don't need to fight you today because the scout has just confirmed you'll be out of water by Thursday. This total awareness is what makes the light cavalry's maneuvers feel like magic. They seem to teleport behind you because they knew where you were going before you even finished your morning councils. They don't have to guess where the gap in your line will be. They've been watching you struggle with that loose axle on the supply wagon for 3 miles. The psychological weight of this, the feeling of being watched by an invisible, omniscient enemy, is what finally causes the discipline of the heavy knights to snap. You realize that in this war, the most dangerous weapon isn't the sword or the horse, it's the whisper. It's the shepherd who points a finger toward the mountain, the monk who mentions a secret ford in the river, the merchant who notices the king's horses are limping. The Moors integrated this human geography into their tactical DNA. As the scout vanishes back into the scrub brush, as silent as a ghost, you re-left with the chilling certainty that your secret movement is currently being discussed over tea in a fortress 20 miles away. You look down at your mappa, beautiful parchment with gold leaf and stylized mountains. It's a work of art, but compared to the scout's lived experience, it's a child's drawing. You are trying to conquer a reality you don't even recognize, while the Moors are simply moving through their own backyard. You fold the parchment with a sigh, the sound of the paper crisp in the still air. The deep dive into this warfare is revealing a truth you didn't want to face. You outmaneuver someone who is already standing at the finish line, waiting for you to arrive. You're sitting atop your destrier, your knees locked into the high pommel of your war saddle, feeling the collective tension of 1,000 men. This is the moment the songs are written about. The trumpets blare a sharp, brassy command that cuts through the stagnant air. You lower your lance, tucking the heavy ashwood shaft under your right arm. You and your brothers-in-arms begin to move. It starts as a trot, a rhythmic clanking of iron, and then it builds. You feel the ground begin to groan. This is the shock and awe of the heavy cavalry charge, a physical manifestation of European power. You are a wall of metal moving at 20 miles per hour, and in your mind, there is nothing on God's green earth that can stop this momentum. You are the unstoppable force, and you're looking for your immovable object. But as you reach a gallop, you realize the object isn't there. The Moorish line, which looked so solid a moment ago, is fragmenting. They aren't running away in a panic. They are bleeding outward. It's like throwing a rock into a pool of mercury. Instead of a satisfying crunch of wood on wood, your lance meets nothing but air. The Moorish riders have split into small cells, veering left and right with a precision that makes your straight-line charge look clumsy and primitive. You've committed all your energy to a single point in space, but the Moors have simply deleted that point. You are now hurtling past them, your momentum carrying you far beyond the engagement zone, while they are already turning to pepper your exposed rear with javelins. This is the myth of the unstoppable charge. In the wet, flat fields of northern Europe, a line of knights could roll over an infantry formation like a tidal wave. But here, the Moors refuse to play the role of the stationary target. They understand a fundamental truth of physics that your commanders seem to have forgotten. A charge is only as effective as its impact. If there is no impact, the charge is just an incredibly expensive way to get your horses tired. You look back over your shoulder and see your formation, the pride of your duchy now scattered and breathless, while the heathens are circling you like wolves around a wounded bear. A mainstream historical fact? The couched lance technique was actually a relatively new development in the 11th century. It required specialized stirrups and a high-backed saddle to prevent the rider from being blown off the back of the horse by the force of his own hit. While it was devastating in a hidden collision, it made the knight almost entirely specialized for one-dimensional movement. The Moorish light cavalry, by contrast, used a free spear technique, allowing them to thrust in 360 degrees. They sacrificed the one-hit kill for the ability to fight in any direction at any time. For a quirky, fringe tidbit, some Moorish chronicles mock the Frankish charge by comparing the knights to iron-clothed beetles that can T-turn once they start rolling. There, as a persistent story of a Moorish commander who supposedly sat on a silk carpet in the middle of the battlefield, sipping sherbet, while a Frankish charge thundered toward him. At the last possible second, his light cavalry opened a gap. The knights flew past him, and he didn't even spill a drop. It's likely a bit of wartime propaganda, but it perfectly captures the psychological disdain the Moors had for the clumsy northern style of war. Historians still argue whether the failed charge at battles like Alartsos was due to superior Moorish agility or a lack of coordination. Among the various Christian kings, some scholars suggest that the heavy knights actually did break the first line of the Moorish army, but because they couldn't slow down or turn, they became victims of their own success, riding deep into a pocket where they were surrounded and slaughtered by the second and third lines of light reserves. You feel the weight of your lance now, and it feels like a liability. It's 10 feet of dead weight that you can't easily turn. You drop at a piece of equipment that cost as much as a peasant's cottageon. Draw your sword, but even then, you're at a disadvantage. Your horse is blown, his lungs heaving so hard you can feel it through your stirrups. The Moorish riders are pulsing in and out. They dart in, deliver a quick thrust, and retreat before you can even bring your blade around. They are exploiting the recovery time of your heavy movements. Every swing you miss drains your stamina. Every turn your horse makes is slower than the last. The shock has worn off, and all that's left is the awe of how quickly your power has evaporated. You were told that one charge would end the day. You were told that the Saracens couldn't stand the sight of a Christian knight in full career. But they didn't just stand it, they welcomed it. They used your own aggression as a lure. You realize that the unstoppable charge is only a weapon if you have a target that shares your sense of honor. To the Moors, staying still to be hit isn't honorable. It's just bad math. As you try to rally your men, you see the true cost of the myth. Dozens of knights have been unhorsed, not by a better warrior, but by the simple physics of overextension. Their horses tripped, or they were pulled down by multiple light riders once they lost their speed. A knight on the ground in Iberia is just a very expensive piece of scrap metal. You watch a group of Berbers methodically dispatch a count who is famous for his prowess in the tournament circuit back home. Here, his trophies mean nothing. His unstoppable momentum has been replaced by the cold, hard reality of a javelin in the ribs. The sun begins to bake the blood onto your armor, the metallic smell mixing with the scent of horse sweat. You realize that the era of the Iron Giant might be coming to an end, or at least it has met its match in the Leathern Ghost. You need to find a way to slow the world down, but the Moors keep it moving at a frantic, dizzying pace. You are a man built for a world of stone and iron, fighting an enemy made of wind and fire. And as the dust settles, you realize that the wind doesn't break, it only shifts. You are perched on a sun-baked stone rampart, the rough granite scraping against your leather-lined gloves as you look down from the walls of a besieged fortress. Below you, the great machine of Frankish siege warfare is at a standstill. Huge trebuchets sit silent, their wooden arms like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky. And the heavy knights, the men who are supposed to be the teeth of this operation, are slumped in the shade of their tents. You aren't watching a battle of walls, you are watching a battle of stomachs. This is the reality of the Iberian siege, where the Moorish light cavalry acts not as a wall breaker, but as a skirmish interruption force. They are the reason that unstoppable heavy armies simply wither away outside the gates. To your left, you see a dust cloud on the horizon. It's the supply train 20 wagons filled with grain, salt, pork, and fresh water, guarded by a company of heavy infantry. But before they can reach the safety of the camp, the ghosts appear. 100 jinnetes materialize from a dry ravine, moving with a speed that makes your heart skip. They don't attack the armored guards hidden, that would be foolish. Instead, they ride in a wide arc, their javelins raining down on the oxen and the unarmored mule drivers. Within minutes, the draft animals are dead or stampeding, the wagons are overturned, and the lifeline of the army is a smoking ruin. By the time the heavy knights can even saddle their horses to intervene, the Moors have vanished back into the scrub. This is the death of 1,000 supply cuts. The Moorish light cavalry understands that a siege is a metabolic race. The army outside the walls needs thousands of calories a day just to exist. By systematically hunting every foraging party and burning every grain field within a 20-mile radius, the light cavalry turns the besiegers into the besieged. You see the knights looking at their own horses, realizing that the massive destriers are becoming liabilities. A horse that can be fed is just a very heavy pet that you eventually have to eat. You, re-witnessing the tactical inversion of power, the men in the impregnable castle are eating better than the men with the unstoppable swords. A mainstream historical fact, the skirmish interruption was a formalized part of Al-Andalus's defensive doctrine. They used a network of watchtowers called ataliyas to signal the approach of supply columns. The light cavalry would be stationed at strike points miles away from the main siege. This allowed them to maintain their mobility and avoid being pinned down themselves. This strategy was so successful that many Christian sieges in the 10th and 11th centuries were abandoned not because the walls held, but because the army simply ran out of shoes and bread. For a quirky fringe tidbit, during the siege of Toledo, there are accounts of Moorish riders who would sneak close to the enemy camp at night, not to kill, but to cut the cinches or girths of the knights' saddles. When the knights scrambled to mount their horses during a dawn alarm, their saddles would slide right off the horse's back, dumping the proud nobles into the mud. It's a low-stakes, high-humiliation prank that served a vital purpose. It delayed the heavy cavalry, response time by those crucial few minutes needed for the light scouts to finish their raid and escape. Historians still argue whether the static siege was a fundamental cultural failure of the Frankish military mind when applied to the Iberian landscape. Some argue that the northern knights were too obsessed with the glory of the assault and ignored the boring reality of logistics. Others suggest that the Moors had a superior understanding of asymmetric endurance, the idea that you need to defeat an army if you can just wait for its support system to evaporate under the sun. You look down at the camp again. A group of knights is trying to organize a sweep of the surrounding hills to clear out the skirmishers. It's a pathetic sight. They are moving in a tight, heavy block, while the jinetes sit on a ridge half a mile away, casually grooming their horses. Every time the knights move toward them, the light cavalry moves exactly the same distance away. It's like a magnet repelling iron. The knights are burning through the last of their horses' energy, while the Moors are essentially on a light afternoon stroll. You realize that outmaneuvering in a siege isn't about speed. It's about the geometry of frustration. The psychological toll is visible on every face in the camp. There is a specific kind of madness that sets in when you are surrounded by an enemy you can see but can never touch. The knights feel emasculated by the light cavalry. They want a duel. They are being given a chore. They want to show their prowess. They are being shown their irrelevance. You see a knight throw his gauntlet at the ground in a fit of Raja gesture of defiance against a ghost. The jinetes don't throw gauntlets. They throw javelins, and they never miss a chance to remind you that they are the ones who control the exits. As the sun dips below the horizon, the fires in the Moorish camp start to twinkle like malevolent stars. They are eating fresh bread and dates, probably laughing about the Iron Men who are currently chewing on leather straps to dull their hunger. You realize that the siege is already over. The walls didn't need to fall because the ground beneath the attackers' feet has been stolen. The light cavalry has won the battle of the calories, and tomorrow the unstoppable army will begin the long, humiliating crawl back to the north, leaving their heavy siege engines to rot in the dust. You feel a change in the air, a sharpening of the atmosphere that has nothing to do with the weather. The year is 1086, and the relatively civilized skirmishing of the Tifa kingdoms has been replaced by a grim, fanatical energy. You are standing on the plains of Sagrajas, and for the first time, the Moorish light cavalry across from you doesn't just look like a collection of agile individuals. They look like a machine. These are the Almoravids, Berber Munster-Ned warriors from the Sahara. They don't wear the flashy silks or the perfume of the Andalusian lords you've fought before. They are draped in indigo and black, their faces veiled by the litham, leaving only their eyes visible. The maneuver has just been married to discipline, and the result is a terrifying new evolution of the jinete. The Almoravids brought a tactical reformation that stunned the Frankish knights. While the local Moorish riders were masters of the loose circle, the Almoravids introduced the use of the wall of drums. As you sit on your horse, the sound hits you a deep, rhythmic thumping that vibrates in your very marrow. Hundreds of African drums are beating in unison, a psychological weapon that unnerves your European destrier, making him skittish and hard to control. Under the cover of this sonic wall, the light cavalry moves in eerie, silent coordination. They aren't just darting in and out. They are executing complex, nested maneuvers that feel like a pre-programmed ritual. You realize the leathern ghost has just found a soul of iron. A mainstream historical fact, the Almoravid invasion, represented a fundamentalist shift in Iberian warfare. Before their arrival, Christian and Muslim knights often shared a similar courtly culture of limited warfare. The Almoravids, however, viewed the conflict as a total war. At the Battle of Sagraja-Zalaka, they utilized their light cavalry to execute a massive double envelopment that virtually annihilated the army of Alfonso VI. It was a wake-up call to the north. The speed of the south was no longer just a defensive tool. It was now a predatory one. For a quirky fringe tidbit, the Almoravid riders were said to use camel skin shields that were even tougher than the standard bovine adargas. But the real oddity was their use of camels as a tactical screen. The scent of camels is famously loathed by horses who aren't used to them. The Almoravids would place a line of camels in front of their light cavalry. When the Frankish knights charged, their horses would catch the scent of the camels, panic, and refuse to advance. It's a biological roadblock. You're trying to be a hero, but your horse is currently trying to climb a tree to get away from a smell he doesn't understand. Historians still argue whether the Almoravid success was due to their superior discipline, or if the Iberian Moors were simply too soft and divided to hold back the Christian advance themselves. There is a heated debate about the Sahara effect, the idea that the extreme hardships of the desert created a warrior class that was physiologically superior in endurance to both the Northern Knights and the city-dwelling Andalusians. Was it their faith, or was it just the fact that they grew up in a place where light was the only way to stay alive? You watch as an Almoravid unit executes a feigned retreat, remember, the tornandira, but this time, it's different. They don't just scatter, they peel off in perfect sections, drawing your vanguard into a killing zone where a second line of riders is already waiting with their bows drawn. The level of unit cohesion is something you've never seen. Your own knights operate on personal glory. Everyone wants to be the first to hit the enemy. The Almoravids operate as a single organism. You see a knight beside you get his horse's legs swept out by a low-swinging spear. And before he can even hit the ground, 3 Almoravid riders have already moved past him to the next target. They aren't lingering for the kill. They are processing the battlefield. The shadowboxing we talked about in Section 8 has become more lethal. These riders don't just hover, they hunt. They use their speed to dictate the geometry of the fight, so precisely that you feel like you being herded into a pen. You realize that your heavy armor is no longer a protection, it's a target. The Almoravids have perfected the art of the joint strike, aiming their light spears specifically at the gaps in your malfa armpits, the groin, the neck. They are using their agility to perform high-speed surgery on your formation. As the sun begins to set over the blood-stained field of Sagrages, the drumming stops, replaced by a silence that is even more terrifying. You see the indigo-clad riders standing perfectly still on their horses, watching the remnants of your army retreat. They don't cheer, they don't boast, they just wait. You realize that the century of the night in Spain has hit a wall. You aren't just fighting a different tactic anymore. You're fighting a different civilization of war. The light cavalry has been weaponized by a religious fervor that makes your chivalry look like a dusty, old-fashioned hobby. You pull your cloak tight against the rising chill. The scent of camel and dust lingers in your nostrils. You've survived the day, but the Iron Man is shaken. You've seen what happens when the agility of the Berber is directed by the iron will of the monk. It's a combination that will keep the Christian kings of the north awake for the next 100 years, staring at the maps and wondering how you fight an enemy that moves like the wind but strikes with the weight of a mountain. The drumming of the Almoravids has faded into the history books, but the air in Iberia hasn't grown any less tense. It is now the mid-12th century, and you are witnessing the arrival of the Almohads that unifies. If the Almoravids were the iron-willed monks of the desert, the Almohads are the intellectualized, disciplined powerhouse of the Atlas Mountains. You stand on a ridge overlooking the valley of Alartzos in 1195, and you see that the light cavalry hasn't just remained a staple, it has become the scalpel of a grand strategic machine. You look at the Christian king Alfonso VIII's army, a magnificent, glittering array of heavy knights from across Europe. They look like the pinnacle of medieval power. But as you watch the Almohad response, you realize that the outmaneuvering has moved from the tactical to the psychological and structural level. The Almohads have refined the jinete into a multi-layered force. Behind the traditional Berber skirmishers, you see the Black Guard disciplined infantry, who provide a solid anchor butt. It is the light cavalry on the wings that holds your attention. They aren't just here to harass, they are here to execute a sophisticated trap. While the Christian knights are eager to prove their crusader zeal with a massive hidden charge, the Almohad Caliph, Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Manzur, is playing a much deeper game. He has placed his most agile riders in the center, specifically instructed to give ground. It's the tornandira on a grand continental scale. As the Christian knights launch their unstoppable charge, you see the Almohad center buckle. To the heavy knights, it looks like a victory. They scream their war cries, leaning into their lances, driving deeper and deeper into the Moorish lines. But you, from your vantage point, see the disaster unfolding. The retreating light cavalry isn't fleeing, they are channeling the knights. The heavy cavalry is being sucked into a funnel. As the knights lose their momentum in the thick of the Almohad camp, the wings the elite light cavalry reserves suddenly snap shut like a pair of shears. You re-watching the heavy hitters of Europe being digested by a formation that refused to stay solid enough to be broken. A mainstream historical fact, the Battle of Alartzos was one of the most lopsided defeats in the history of the Reconquest. It wasn't just a loss, it was a total collapse of the Christian strategic position for a generation. The Almohads used their light cavalry to not only win the battle, but to relentlessly pursue the survivors, preventing them from regrouping. This pursuit phase is where the light horse truly outshines the heavy. A knight on a blown destrier cannot escape a Berber on a fresh stallion. The light cavalry transformed a retreat into a massacre, or a quirky fringe tidbit. Almohad military doctrine emphasized the use of white noise and visual deception. Some chronicles suggest they would have their light cavalry carry extra banners and ride in wide, dusty circles far from the main action, to make their numbers appear 3 times larger than they actually were. To a tired, thirsty knight squinting through a helmet slit, it looked like an infinite sea of enemies was closing in from every direction. It's stealth technology through the medium of dust and fabric. You're fighting an army that is using the very air against your sanity. Historians still argue whether the Almohads' ultimate failure to hold Iberia was due to a military decline or a political overreach, while their light cavalry tactics remained superior on the field. The empire of the two shores, Spain and North Africa, became too large to defend against the constant, grinding pressure of the north. Some argue that the Almohad reliance on tribal light cavalry became a liability when those tribes started fighting each other, proving that even the most agile military machine can be dismantled by its own internal friction. You watch as the Almohad riders close the gap. They are using their composite bows now. Remember, a knight on foot is just a very slow-moving target. By targeting the mounts, the Almohad light cavalry effectively disarms the heavy cavalry without ever having to touch their armor. You see the pride of Castile being reduced to men stumbling through the dirt, weighed down by the very iron that was supposed to make them invincible. The Almohad riders don't even have to get close. They just keep circling, their arrows finding the soft underbelly of the horses, until the charge simply peters out into a confused, bloody mess. There is a cold, calculated efficiency to the Almohad way of war that makes the previous centuries look like amateur hour. They have turned the skirmish into a science. You realize that outmaneuvering isn't just about moving your body, it's about moving the enemy's expectations. The Christian kings expected a battle of strength, but the Almohads gave them a battle of space. They gave the knights all the room in the world to charge, right up until the moment that room became a cage. As the sun sets over the ruins of the Christian camp, you see the Almohad Caliph surveying the field. He isn't celebrating with the boisterousness of a Frankish lord, he is silent, his light cavalry already repositioning to secure the surrounding territory. They move with the quiet confidence of people who own the clock. You realize that for all the iron brought down from the Pyrenees, it is the spirit of the wind that still dictates the fate of the peninsula. The heavy knights are learning that in Iberia, the faster you run toward victory, the faster you might be running into a trap. You take a deep breath, the smell of burnt dry grass and spent adrenaline filling the air. This section of our journey is a reminder that even when the Iron Men think they've adapted, the South finds a new way to stay one step ahead. The Almohads have taken the traditional jinete and turned him into a soldier of an empire, a disciplined ghost that haunts the dreams of every king from Leon to Aragon. And as the moon rises, you see those ghosts moving across the plains, silent, fast, and utterly in control of the night. You are sitting in a tent on the eve of battle, listening to a group of Frankish counts argue over the concept of honneur. To these men, warfare is not just a tactical necessity, it is a liturgical act. To win by deceit, to strike from behind, or God forbid to retreat in the face of the enemy, is to forfeit one's soul and status. You look at their heavy, gilded spurs and realize that the rigid chivalric code is essentially a set of handcuffs. This is the 16th part of our journey, and we are dissecting the psychological honor trap that kept the heavy knight from ever truly adapting to the Moorish style of war. While the jinete views a tactical retreat as a brilliant maneuver, the Frankish knight views it as a stain that could take generations of heraldry to wash out the Moorish light cavalrymen. Don't have these hang-ups. To them, the goal of war is to win while remaining alive to enjoy the victory. Their martial code, influenced by the Furussia traditions of the East, emphasizes cunning as a primary virtue of a warrior. They see the Frankish insistence on the hidden charge as a form of noble stupidity. You see this play out on the field. A Moorish rider will happily lead you on a wild goose chase for 5 miles, laughing as your horse's heart gives out, because to him, outthinking you is the highest form of skill. To the knight, this is cowardice, but you starting to realize that cowardice is a very effective way to stay in the saddle. The economic cost of this honor is staggering. A knight's status is tied to his gear. He must have the heaviest mail, the tallest horse, and the most decorated shield to prove his worth. This makes him slow, yes, but it also makes him predictable. The Moors know that if they insult a Frankish noble's banner, he will charge. They use your own sense of self-importance as a remote control device. You are witnessing the weaponization of ego. By simply appearing to flee, the light cavalry triggers a pursuit reflex in the knight that is almost biological in its intensity. He cannot help himself. His code demands that he chase the fleeing foe, even if his brain knows it's a trap, a mainstream historical fact. The chivalric code was often at direct odds with military science in the 12th and 13th centuries. Many battles were lost because knights refused to wait for infantry support or failed to hold a defensive line, believing that glory belonged only to the first man to strike the enemy. In Iberia, this lack of discipline was the #1 cause of Christian defeats. The Moorish commanders, particularly under the Almohad and Almoravid regimes, operated under a much stricter top-down military hierarchy where honor was found in obeying the caliph's strategy, not in solo heroics. For a quirky fringe tidbit, there was a specific court of honor in some Christian kingdoms where a knight could be legally stripped of his title if he was seen mimicking the heathen by using a light heart-shaped shield or riding with short stirrups. They viewed the jinete style as effeminate because it relied on grace and speed rather than raw masculine force. You probably wouldn't survive the irony of being executed by your own king for the crime of using the tactics that actually work. It's a literal case of looking good while losing. Historians still argue whether the stubbornness of the knights was a personal failing or a systemic necessity. Some suggest that the heavy armor and the straight-head charge were the only things keeping the socially fragile feudal armies together. If you allowed knights to maneuver and skirmish like the Moors, you risked the entire social order collapsing. As the common infantry might realize, their superior lords were just as vulnerable as anyone else. The iron mask of the knight was as much about political theater as it was about protection. You see a young squire polishing a knight's helmet nearby. The boy is wide-eyed, dreaming of the day he can participate in a glorious charge. You want to tell him that the glory he seeks is a death trap in this climate. You want to explain that the man who survives the next 20 years will be the one who learns to swallow his pride and ride a smaller horse, but you know he won't listen. To him, the jinete is a shadow, a ghost, a thing to be despised. He doesn't see the technical mastery. He only sees a man who won't stand still and fight like a man. This cultural barrier is what truly allowed the Moorish light cavalry to dominate for centuries. It wasn't just that they were faster, it was that they were allowed to be faster. They had the intellectual permission to be fluid. The Frankish knight, however, was a prisoner of his own myth. He was a statue in a world that demanded a dancer. As you watch the sun set over the camp, you see the knights practicing their proper lunges, while in the distance, the Moorish scouts are practicing their improper retreats. The mismatch isn't just in the stirrups, it's in the soul. You realize that for the heavy knight to win, he doesn't just need better horses or lighter mail. He needs a total psychological revolution. He needs to stop worrying about what the poets in Paris will say and start worrying about what the Berbers on the next ridge are doing. But as the trumpets sound for the evening meal and the counts take their places at the head of the table, draped in heavy furs despite the heat, you realize that some traditions are harder to break than a stone wall. The Iron Man would rather break than bend, and the Moorish light cavalry is more than happy to provide the pressure. You are standing in a border camp along the Tagus River, and for a moment, you're confused. You see a group of riders approaching. They're wearing the familiar Christian cross on their surcoats, but everything else about them looks wrong. Their horses are small and lean, their knees are tucked high in short stirrups, and they carrying the heart-shaped adarga shields UV come to associate with the Moorish scouts. These aren't invaders from the south, they are the Genitours Christian light cavalry, who have finally, after centuries of bruises and dehydration, decided that if you can't beat the heathen, you might as well dress like him. This is the moment of cross-pollination, where the rigid Frankish identity begins to melt into a hybrid Iberian martial culture. You watch as these Genitours practice a maneuver. They gallop in a circle, hurling javelins with a flick of the wrist that looks entirely effortless. There is no clanking of heavy mail here. They wear light brigandines or simple leather jackets. To a pure Frankish knight, these men look like traitors to their class. But to the kings of Castile and Aragon, they are the only reason the border is still holding. The Iron Man is being replaced by the frontierman. You realize that the peninsula has become a giant laboratory of war, where survival is more important than the social conventions of the north. The outmaneuvering is no longer one-sided. The Christians are learning to speak the language of speed, a mainstream historical fact. The janiteurs or jinetes became a permanent and vital branch of the Spanish military. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Christian armies were often composed of roughly 50% heavy cavalry and 50% light janiteurs. This tactical dualism allowed them to finally match the Moors at their own game. They would use the light cavalry to screen the army and counter the Moorish skirmishers, while keeping the heavy knights in reserve for the one decisive hammer blow when the enemy was finally pinned down for a quirky fringe tidbit. This cultural blending went so deep that some Christian janiteurs actually preferred Moorish-style tack and clothing because it was simply better for the climate. There are records of church officials complaining that Christian soldiers were starting to look like Saracens, wearing turbans and flowing robes to stay cool. There was even a debate about whether a prayer said by a man in a turban was lesser in the eyes of God. Re-witnessing a world where the practical demands of not dying from heatstroke are slowly winning out over religious aesthetics. Historians still argue whether this orientalization of the Spanish military was the true key to the eventual Christian victory of the Reconquista. Some scholars argue that without adopting light cavalry, the Christian north would have been pushed back into the Pyrenees. Others contend that the heavy knight remained the closing argument of every major battle, and the light cavalry was merely a secondary support system. The debate essentially boils down to who wins the war? The man who starts the fight, the skirmisher, or the man who ends it, the knight? You walk through the horse lines and notice a janitor grooming a horse that looks remarkably like the Berber stallions. We saw in Section 6 the arms race has become a breeding race. Christian lords are now actively raiding Moorish territories specifically to steal high-quality breeding stock. They are looking for gold or land as much as they looking for those Arabian-Iberian bloodlines. You see the irony? The very thing that made the Moors unstoppable for centuries is now being used to dismantle their borders. The light cavalry tactic has been stolen, and with it, the Moorish monopoly on the Iberian landscape. This cross-pollination created a unique warrior class, the caballero villano, or peasant knight. These were men who were unnecessarily of noble birth, but were granted the status of a knight if they could provide a horse and the equipment of a light cavalryman. This broke the feudal monopoly on warfare. Suddenly, the middle class of the frontier was becoming a mobile, lethal force. You realize that the Moorish jinete didn't just change how wars were fought, he changed the social structure of the entire peninsula. The need for speed was so great that the kings were willing to trade social hierarchy for tactical survival. As you watch a janitor and a traditional heavy knight share a meal by the fire, you see the tension. The knight still looks down on the light rider, but there's a new, grudging respect. He knows that without that light scout, he'd be wandering blindly into a canyon. The janitor, meanwhile, looks at the knight's heavy armor with a mix of pity and amusement. He knows he can ride circles around the noble and be home in time for dinner while the knight is still trying to unbuckle his greaves. The deep dive has reached a point of synthesis. The two styles are no longer opposing forces. They are becoming two parts of a single Iberian machine. The knight is quiet, but you can hear the soft nickering of the horses. They are the true winners of this exchange, a new breed for a new kind of war. You realize that the Reconquista is no longer a clash of iron versus wind. It's a clash of two different kinds of wind, both of them fueled by the same sun, the same dust, and the same desperate desire to own this red earth. The Moorish light cavalry may have held the advantage for centuries, but they've taught their enemies too well. The Leathern Ghost now has a twin, and the shadow boxing is about to get a lot more complicated. You are crouched in the tall yellow grass of a dry riverbed, and the air around you is suddenly filled with a sound like 1,000 angry wasps. It's a rhythmic thrum hiss, thrum hiss. You look up just in time to see a flight of short, thick arrows arching over the ridge. This is the sting of the composite recurve bow, the weapon that turned the Moorish light cavalry from a mere nuisance into a long-distance killing machine, while the Frankish knight is a creature of the sword and lance weapons that require him to get uncomfortably close to his problems. The Moorish rider is a practitioner of the kill-from-a-distance philosophy. You feel a sharp tug at your surcoat as an arrow zips through the fabric, missing your ribs by an inch. You realize that you aren't just being outmaneuvered, you're being outranged. The recurve bow is a marvel of ancient engineering that the West simply had mastered for the saddle. Unlike the longbow, the composite bow is made of a sandwich of materials, horn on the inside to handle compression, and sinew on the outside to handle tension, all glued to a wooden core. This spring-loaded design allows it to be short and compact, but incredibly powerful. You watch a rider gallop past at 40 miles per hour. He drops his reins, steers with his knees, and looses 3 arrows in the time it takes you to even draw your sword. He isn't aiming for your armor, he's aiming for your horse's eyes, his throat, or the gaps in your horse's leather barding. A mainstream historical fact. The use of horse archers in Iberia was a distinct point of divergence between the Western and Eastern Islamic worlds, while the Middle East relied heavily on Turkish-style horse archers. The Moors in Iberia used a mix of javelin throwers and archers. However, the presence of these archers meant that a heavy cavalry charge often had to endure several volleys of death before they could even reach the enemy. By the time the knights closed the distance, their horses were often so peppered with arrows that the shock of the charge was entirely lost. For a quirky, fringe tidbit, some Moorish archery manuals from the 12th century suggest that a rider should hold extra arrows in his mouth or between his fingers to increase his rate of fire. They also describe poisoning the tips with the juice of certain local lilies or hellebore, not necessarily to kill the knight instantly, but to cause the horse to panic or swell in the heat, making it unrideable. Imagine your horse suddenly breaking out in hives and losing its mind in the middle of a battle because of a botanical strike. It's a very specialized form of biological warfare. Historians still argue whether the Frankish failure to adopt the horse bow was a technological limitation or a cultural one. The construction of a composite bow requires specific climates and years of curing time. The damp forests of northern Europe would often cause the animal glue in a recurve bow to delaminate and fall apart. However, many scholars believe it was also a warrior ego issue. The bow was seen as the weapon of the cowardly commoner or the treacherous Easterner. A true knight settled his scores with cold steel and a firm grip, not with a fancy stick from 100 yards away. You watch as a group of knights tries to respond by using their own crossbows. It's a disaster. The crossbow is powerful, but it's slow to reload and incredibly awkward to handle on a bouncing horse. By the time your man has cranked his windlass and set his bolt, the Moorish archer has already fired 5 shots and moved to a different zip code. It's the 12th century version of a sniper fight where one side has a bolt-action rifle and the other has a... You feel a growing sense of helplessness. You are built for a collision that the enemy is systematically preventing with a rain of wood and horn. The psychological effect of being shot at by someone you can't reach is devastating. You can see the frustration in the knight's eyes. They want to vent their rage, but their rage has no target. The Moorish archer stays exactly 70 yards away, the sweet spot where his arrows are lethal but your heavy throwing spears. Can T reach? He's kiting you, drawing you out, making you waste your energy while he stays perfectly cool. You realize that the maneuver isn't just about where the horse goes, it's about managing the kill zone around the horse. As the sun catches the glint of another arrow mid-flight, you realize that the Moors have turned the air itself into a weapon. They've extended their reach far beyond their physical bodies. You look at your heavy shield, now bristling with half a dozen arrows like a metallic porcupine. It's heavy, it's dragging on your arm, and it's a constant reminder that the enemy is playing a different game. They don't want your blood on their hands. They're perfectly happy to watch you bleed out from across the field. The day ends with the sound of those bows still ringing in your ears. The jinete has shown you that speed is not just about the feet, it's about the hands and the eyes. He has outmaneuvered your very concept of distance. As you pull an arrow from your horse's saddle blanket, thankful it didn't hit bone, you realize that for the heavy knight to survive, he either needs to grow longer arms or find a way to make the world much smaller. And in the Wideopan plains of Iberia, neither seems likely. The sun has long since dropped behind the jagged peaks of the Sierra Morena, but for you, the day is far from over. In fact, the real danger is just beginning. You are sitting in a darkened camp, your hand never straying more than an inch from your sword hilt. This is the era of the Acephada, seasonal summer redond, the Moorish. Light cavalry has turned the night into their primary theater of operations. In the north, war usually stops when the sun goes down. There's a gentleman's agreement that you sleep, recover, and start again at dawn. But the Jinetes don't subscribe to your schedule. To them, the darkness is a cloak that makes their light equipment even more effective. You aren't just being outmaneuvered on the field anymore, you're being outmaneuvered by the clock. You hear it before you see it, a muffled thud of hooves. Remember that quirky tidbit about wrapping horse hooves in esparto grass? You're experiencing it now. The sound doesn't carry like the metallic clack of your own iron-shod destriers. It's a soft, ghostly drumming that seems to come from every direction at once. Suddenly, the perimeter of your camp erupts in flames. The Moors aren't looking for a pitched battle in the dark. They are here for structural chaos. They hurl jars of Greek fire or naphtha-soaked rags into your grain stores and horse lines. Within seconds, the camp is a screaming, light-blinded mess of smoke and panic. This is the night maneuver, a psychological masterstroke, while you struggle to buckle your heavy mail in the dark, a task that is nearly impossible without a squire and a torchta. Moorish riders are already halfway through their mission. They don't need to kill every night. They just need to kill your morale and your transport. You watch a group of shadows dart through the flickering firelight, cutting the picket lines of your horses. Your massive, expensive war horses, terrified by the smell of smoke and the shouting, bolt into the darkness. In 10 minutes, the Moors have disarmed 100 knights without swinging a single blade. They vanish as quickly as they appeared, leaving you to deal with the ashes. A mainstream historical fact, the Acephada was a pillar of the Cordoban Caliphate's grand strategy. Every summer, like clockwork, the Moors would launch these rapid response raids deep into Christian territory. They weren't always looking for permanent conquest. They were practicing preventative destruction. By burning crops and seizing livestock, they ensured the Christian north remained too poor and too hungry to organize a massive heavy cavalry invasion of the south. It was a war of economic attrition fought at a gallop. For a quirky, fringe tidbit, Moorish night traders were said to use scent signals to identify each other in the chaos of a dark camp. They would rub a specific oil, often jasmine or heavy musk, on their shoulders. If you ran into someone in the smoke and they didn't smell like a flower garden, you stabbed them. It's a low-tech IFF identification, friend or foe system. To the Frankish knight, who probably smells like rusted iron and unwashed wool, this floral scent in the middle of a slaughter must have felt surreal, almost hallucinogenic. Historians still argue whether the Acephas were ultimately counterproductive. Some argue that by constantly poking the northern bear, the Moors inadvertently forced the Christian kingdoms to militarize and unify faster than they would have otherwise. Others suggest that without these raids, the Reconquista would have ended 300 years earlier, and that the light cavalry was the only thing keeping the Iron Tide at bay by perpetually resetting the Christians' economic clock. You stand in the middle of your ruined camp, the heat from the burning grain wagons singeing your face. You realize that your heavy armor is a liability in a night fight. It's loud, it restricts your breathing, and it makes you a slow-moving target for anyone with a torch. The Jinetes, in their light tunics and soft boots, move through the camp like smoke through a forest. They are environmental warriors. They use the terrain, the light, and the very time of day as weapons. You are a ceremonial warrior. You require a specific set of conditions to be effective, and the Moors are making sure those conditions never exist. The outmaneuvering here is total. It's a 2-4-hour cycle of pressure. If you move during the day, they harass you with javelins and heat. If you stop at night, they burn your food and steal your horses. There is no safe space for a heavy cavalry force in this environment. You feel a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that no amount of sleep can fix. It's as the fatigue of a man who is being hunted by an enemy that doesn't need to sleep because he's already mastered the rhythm of the land. As the first gray light of dawn begins to creep over the horizon, you look at the damage. The Moors are gone, likely 10 miles away by now, resting in a cool ravine they've known for generations. You re-left to pick up the pieces of a battle you never even got to participate in. You look at your heavy lance, lying in the dirt next to a scorched wagon wheel. It looks like a relic of a different age, a tool for a war that no longer exists. The light cavalry has won the night, and in doing so, they've already won the next day before it has even begun. You are standing on a dusty plateau near the mountain pass of Despeniperos, and the air is vibrating with a tension that feels like a physical weight. The date is July 16, 1212. This is the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, the pivotal moment where centuries of light cavalry dominance and heavy night frustration finally reach a boiling point. This isn't just another skirmish, it is a clash of the titans moment for the Iberian Peninsula. You look across the field at the Almohad Caliph Muhammad al-Nasr, who has literally chained his elite black guard together around his tent to form an immovable human wall. You realize that for once, the Moors are going to stand their ground. The maneuver is about to meet its greatest challenge, a unified Christian North that has finally learned how to close the net. You feel the familiar weight of your mail, but there's a new discipline in the ranks around you. The Christian kings Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, moving in a synchronized three-battle formation. They aren't falling for the easy bait today. When the Moorish light cavalry darts forward to perform their usual tornandira, the Christian vanguard doesn't chase them into a trap. Instead, they hold their line, supported by their own geneteurs and crossbowmen. You're witnessing an evolution of the counter-maneuver. The Christians have finally realized that if they move as a single slow grinding machine, the light cavalry's feigned retreats have nowhere to go. You are no longer a lone bull in the ring. You are part of a wall of iron that is slowly pushing the matador into a corner. A mainstream historical fact, Las Navas de Tolosa is widely considered the turning point of the retreat. It was one of the few times the Moors committed to a massive set-piece defensive battle rather than their preferred style of fluid movement. By anchoring themselves to a fixed position, they effectively neutralized their own greatest advantage, the ability to vanish. The Christian victory was so decisive that the Almohad power in Iberia was shattered forever, leading to the collapse of the great empire into smaller, more vulnerable Tifa kingdoms. For a quirky, fringe tidbit, according to legend, the chains of the caliph's guard weren't just a metaphor. Some chronicles claim the soldiers were actually shackled to each other to prevent any maneuvering or retreats. When the King of Navarre finally broke through, he supposedly hacked a piece of the chain away, which is why the coat of arms of Navarre still features chains to this day. It's the ultimate irony. The Moorish forces, the masters of speed, were defeated on the day they chose to tie themselves down. You're watching the death of a tactic through the birth of a literal anchor. Historians still argue whether the Almohad defeat was a failure of the light cavalry or a failure of the caliph's nerves. Some argue that if the jinetes had been allowed to operate in their traditional loose style, they could have harassed the Christian supply lines in the mountains and won a war of attrition. Others suggest that the Christian crusade energy was so overwhelming that no amount of maneuvering could have stopped. The sheer mass of iron, once it reached the plateau, it was a battle where weight finally found a target it could actually hit. You participate in the final charge. It's not the frantic, disorganized sprint of Section 12, it's a measured, devastating roll. As you hit the Almohad lines, you don't feel the empty air of the past. You feel the crunch of impact. The light cavalry on the Moorish wings tries to intervene, but they are blocked by the Christian light horse, the geneteurs, you saw in Section 17. The shadows are being fought by other shadows, leaving the Iron Men free to do what they do best: smash. You see the Caliph's tent, the legendary red tent, and you realize that the psychological wall has been breached. The field is a chaotic symphony of screaming men and clashing metal. But for the first time in centuries, the momentum is entirely on your side. The outmaneuvering has been reversed. By forcing the Moors into a static defense of a holy site, the Christians have turned the light cavalry into a spectator. A Berber stallion is useless if it has nowhere to run. You watch as the elite Moorish riders, realizing the center has collapsed, finally turn to flee for real, not as a tactic, but for survival. But the mountains are behind them, and the Christian light cavalry is now the one doing the hunting. As the sun sets over the thousands of fallen, the scale of the victory starts to sink in. The leathern ghost has been cornered and broken. You look at your dented shield and your bloody sword, and you feel a strange sense of relief. The game of keep away is over. You realize that Las Navas de Tolosa didn't just win a battle, it changed the math of the peninsula. From this day forward, the Moors will be on the defensive, tucked away in the rugged mountains of Granada, where their light cavalry will become a desperate shield rather than an aggressive sword. You wipe the sweat and dust from your face, feeling the cool night air of the mountains. The deep dive has reached its climax. You've seen how speed ruled for centuries, but you've also seen what happens when that speed is forced to stand still. The Iron Man has finally caught the wind, but as you look at the retreating silhouettes of the Moorish riders in the distance, you know they aren't gone yet. They still have one last stronghold, one last mountain range, and 200 more years of shadowboxing left in them. The aftermath of Las Navas de Tolosa has left a permanent mark on your psyche, but it has also changed the very clothes on your back. You are standing in an armory in Toledo, and the heavy floor-length hauberk of your ancestors is nowhere to be seen. Instead, you are being fitted for a brigandina garment of heavy canvas or leather, reinforced with small internal steel plates. It's lighter, it's more flexible, and most importantly, it breathes. You realize that the Iron Man hasn't just won, he has evolved. To stay relevant in a world still populated by lethal Moorish skirmishers, the European knight has had to shed his tank status and become something closer to a brawler. You're witnessing armor evolution as a direct response to centuries of being outpaced. You move your arms, testing the range of motion. For the first time, you can reach across your body without the mail dragging on your shoulders like a bag of wet sand. This shift toward lighter, more articulated protection is a survival mechanism. The knights realized that if the Moors weren't going to stop moving, the knights had to start moving with them. You see your peers adopting the gambeson as a primary defense thickly, quilted linen that can stop a javelin, but whoa, unturn you into a human oven. The heavy in heavy cavalry is becoming a relative term. You are now part of a specialized force designed for interception rather than just collision. A mainstream historical fact. The 13th century saw a massive shift in European armor design, moving away from the Malinli era toward transitional armor. In Spain, this happened faster and with more urgency than in the north. The Spanish style became famous for its pragmatism, combining the heavy protection of the West with the mobility of the East. This was the era where the genitor and the knight began to look more and more alike, creating a middle ground warrior that could survive both a skirmish and a siege. For a quirky fringe tidbit, as armor became lighter, knights began to experiment with silk surcoats over their metal. While it looked like a fashion statement, it was actually a tactical adaptation borrowed from the East. Silk is incredibly tough. When an arrow hits a silk-covered chest, the fabric often doesn't break. Instead, it wraps around the arrowhead as it enters the body. This meant that a doctor could simply pull on the silk to remove the arrow cleanly, preventing the barbs from tearing the flesh on the way out. You're essentially wearing a medieval self-healing bandage over your ribs. Historians still argue whether the move toward lighter armor was a sign of the knights' increasing skill or a sign of their economic decline. Some argue that as the Reconquista progressed, the constant campaigning made the full kit of the high nobility too expensive and exhausting to maintain. Others suggest it was a purely tactical meritocracy. The knights who wore less metal simply lived longer and won more battles. So the fashion followed the body count. You look at your new helmet, it's no longer the heavy great helm that looks like an inverted bucket. It's a bassinet, a lighter, more aerodynamic piece that allows for better airflow and vision. You realize that you can actually see the ground at your horse's feet now. This increase in situational awareness is your best defense against the Moorish light cavalry. You are no longer blind to the javelin thrower on your flank. By shrinking your protection, you've expanded your survival. You've traded the fortress for the shield, and the results are immediate. You feel faster, sharper, and less like a victim of the climate. The Moors, meanwhile, are also adapting as the Christians get lighter and faster. The remaining Nasrid forces in Granada are starting to use more metal, creating their own version of medium cavalry. The two cultures are moving toward a center point, a hybrid martial identity that belongs only to the Iberian Peninsula. You realize that outmaneuvering is a game that both sides are now playing with the same deck of cards. The leathern ghost is putting on a bit of iron, and the Iron Man is shedding his skin. As you walk out of the armory, the sun is still hot, but the weight on your soul feels lighter. You aren't just a relic of the past anymore. You are a tool designed for the present. You realize that the deep dive into this warfare has shown a fundamental truth. The environment always wins, and the only way to beat the environment is to let it change you. You are ready to head back to the frontier, not as a lumbering giant, but as a predator that has finally learned how to breathe in the dust. You're standing by a muddy riverbank, watching a logistics train of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada prepare for a mountain crossing. Your eyes, trained to look for the noble profile of the warhorse, are suddenly drawn to a much humbler creature, the mule, and next to it, a small group of camels. You realize that while we spent our journey talking about the flash and thunder of the Berber stallion, the true secret to Moorish maneuverability was the strategic use of the lower quadrupeds. This is the 22nd section of our journey, where we look at the backbone of the skirmish. The animals that allowed the light cavalry to exist in places where the heavy knights simply starved. The mule is the unsung hero of Iberian warfare. It has the endurance of a donkey and the strength of a horse. But more importantly, it has mountain sense. While your heavy destrier is prone to panic on a narrow ledge, the mule is a stoic, sure-footed climber. The Moors utilized these animals to carry their mobile base into the highest reaches of the Alpujarras. They could transport javelins, waterskins, and grain through paths that looked like vertical stairs. This meant the jinete didn't have to carry his own supplies on his warhorse. He could ride light because his warehouse was a mule following 3 miles behind him on a goat path you didn't even know existed. A mainstream historical fact, the mule was so central to the Iberian economy and military that the Kingdom of Aragon eventually passed laws regulating their breeding. But the Moors remained the masters of the mule logistic system. During the final centuries of the Reconquista, the Nasrid dynasty survived as long as it did because they could move supplies through the Sierra Nevada using pack animals that required half the water and a third of the grain of a standard Frankish baggage horse. For a quirky, fringe tidbit, some Moorish chronicles suggest that the light cavalry would sometimes use decoy camels during night maneuvers. They would tie torches to the humps of camels and send them wandering off in one direction to draw the heavy cavalry's attention. The knights would see a line of flickering lights moving through the valley and charge, thinking they'd caught a baggage train, only to find a few confused camels, while the actual jinnees were raiding their camp from the opposite side. It's the medieval version of a flare countermeasure. And it worked because the smell of the camels alone was enough to keep the knights. Horses from getting too close to investigate the trick, historians still argue whether the mule revolution was a result of the collapse of the Roman road system or a deliberate choice to favor ruggedness over speed. Some argue that the Moors orientalized the Iberian transport system, moving away from wheeled wagons which are useless in the mountains toward pack-saddle logistics. This shift made the Moorish army a fractal force. It could break down into tiny, self-sufficient units and disappear into the landscape, a feat a wagon-dependent Frankish army could never replicate. You watch as a stable hand loads an al-farr double-saddle bagantu, a sturdy mule. The balance is perfect. You realize that the Moorish maneuver was a total system. It wasn't just about the 10 minutes of a charge. It was about the 10 days of the march. The light cavalry could float over the mountains because their supply chain was as agile as they were. You look at your own baggage, train-heavy wooden carts with axles that are currently screaming for grease and horses that are already limping. You are tied to the valley floor. The Moors own the heights. There is a quiet dignity in these pack animals. They don't have the glory of the stallion, but they are the ones who make the glory possible. Without the mule, the heart-shaped shield never reaches the front line. Without the camel, the wall of drums never makes it across the desert. You realize that outmaneuvering an enemy is as much about what's in your bags as what's in your hands. The Moors understood the metabolism of the mountain, and they chose their tools accordingly. As the pack train moves off, disappearing into the rocky folds of the hills with barely a sound, you're left with a sense of the scale of your disadvantage. You've been trying to win a war of speed using a system built for a parade ground. The Moors have been winning a war of survival using a system built for the earth. You look down at your own boots, caked in the heavy mud of the lowlands, and realize that to catch a ghost, you have to be able to follow it where the path ends. You are walking through the bustling market of a frontier town, a place where the air smells of saffron, incense, and wet wool. Here, the boundaries of war are blurred by the realities of trade. You see a Christian knight and a Moorish merchant haggling over the price of a bridle, and it hits you. The outmaneuvering wasn't just happening on the battlefield. It was happening in the workshops and the courts. This is the era of convivencia complex, often bloody, but deeply interconnected period of living together. You realize that for centuries, the The two sides weren't just killing each other. They were studying each other like obsessed scientists. The light cavalry tactics of the south and the heavy armor of the north were constantly bleeding into one another through 1,000 small cultural exchanges. You stop at a stall selling leather goods and pick up a pair of boots. They are soft, flexible, and reach mid-calf nothing like the stiff, heavy footwear of the Frankish heartlands. These are Moorish-style boots designed to feel the stirrup and move with the foot. You notice a Christian soldier nearby wearing them. This is the soft power of the jinete. Long before the kings officially adopted light cavalry units, individual soldiers were voting with their feet, buying the gear that worked in the Iberian climate. You're witnessing a grassroots technological revolution. The Moors didn't just outmaneuver the Franks with horses, they outmaneuvered them with better ideas for daily survival. A mainstream historical fact, the convivencia coexistence, meant that the Iberian Peninsula was the primary gateway for Eastern technologies to enter Europe. This included everything from papermaking and algebra to military innovations like the aforementioned composite bow and the refined bit. This cultural exchange was so potent that by the 13th century, the Spanish way of war was distinct from the rest of Europe. A knight from Castile had more in common tactically with a horseman from Granada than he did with a knight from England or Germany. For a quirky fringe tidbit, there was a fashion trend among the Christian nobility called mudéjar style. Even as they fought the Moors, the Christian elite obsessed over Andalusian aesthetics. There are records of kings demanding that their royal stables be built in the Islamic style because they believed the geometry of the arches helped keep the horses' spirits calm. They even hired Moorish veterinarians to treat their prized destriers with Saracen medicine, which often involved aromatic oils and specific dietary regimes that were centuries ahead of northern bloodletting techniques. You probably would unsurvive the confusion of fighting an enemy during the day and then visiting his cousin's vet clinic at night. But that was the reality of the frontier. Historians still argue whether this cultural blurring actually lengthened the war. Some suggest that because both sides were constantly adopting each other's best tricks, they reached a tactical stalemate that lasted for generations. If the Christians hadn't learned to ride a la jinete, they might have lost early. If the Moors hadn't started adopting heavier infantry tactics from the north, they might have been overwhelmed sooner. It was a race where both runners were constantly swapping shoes. You look up at the architecture of the town's main gate. It's a horseshoe arch, a classic Moorish design, but it's guarded by men in Christian surcoats. This hybrid world is the reason the light cavalry remained so effective for so long. They weren't fighting in a vacuum. They were part of an ecosystem that understood their value. Even when the borders moved, the culture of the light horse remained. You realize that outmaneuvering is also a social act about being the most adaptable person in the room. The Moors weren't just faster on the field. They were the authors of the manual. Everyone else was trying to translate. As you watch the crowd, you see a group of jineteurs, or hybrid riders from Section 17, laughing with a group of local craftsmen. They are the living embodiment of this synthesis. They represent the moment where the clash of civilizations turned into a merger of methods. You realize that the deep dive into this warfare is actually a dive into the birth of a unique Iberian identity. The heavy knight didn't just beat the light horseman, he eventually became a version of him. The sun begins to set, casting a golden light over the tiles of the marketplace. The calls to prayer from a nearby mosque, still standing in this particular gray zone town, mingled with the ringing of church bells. It's a dissonant, beautiful sound. You realize that the 25,000 words of this story aren't just about battles, they're about the slow, grinding process of two worlds becoming one. The light cavalry was the catalyst for this change, forcing a rigid European tradition to bend, flex, and eventually grow into something entirely new. You take a final look at the Moorish boots in your hand and decide to buy them. In this world, you have to be ready to move. The air in the mountains of Granada feels different, thinner, colder, and heavy with the scent of pine and impending endings. It is the late 15th century, and you are standing on a rocky outcrop overlooking the final redoubt of the Nasrid dynasty. This is the 24th section of our journey, and we are witnessing the twilight of the Moorish light cavalry. Below you, the lush valleys of the Vega are no longer a playground for the jinete. They have become a graveyard of tradition. For nearly 800 years, the light horseman was the undisputed master of the Iberian space, but the world has fundamentally changed. You look down at the Spanish encampment of Ferdinand and Isabella, and you don't just see knights. You see rows of long-barreled arquebuses and the massive bronze muzzles of Lombard cannons. The maneuver is facing its final insurmountable wall, the industrialization of death. You watch a small troop of Nasrid light cavalry attempt a classic tornandira against a Spanish scouting party. In the old days, this would have been a masterful display of but now, as the riders wheel their horses to retreat, they aren't met with the frustrated shouts of heavy knights. Instead, there is a thunderous crack, and a cloud of acrid white smoke billows from the Spanish lines. A rider in the back of the Moorish formation is plucked from his saddle as if by an invisible hand. The lead ball from an arquebus doesn't care about the elastic defense of an adarga leather shield. It doesn't care about the dryness of a Berber stallion's limbs. It travels at a speed that makes even the fastest horse look like a statue. The leathern ghost is finally being outmaneuvered by lead and gunpowder, a mainstream historical fact. The conquest of Granada, 1482 to 1492, was the first major European conflict where gunpowder artillery played a decisive central role. Ferdinand and Isabella Santa Hermandad utilized a massive train of siege engines that could reduce a Moorish mountain fortress once, a safe haven for light cavalry, to rubble in days. The jinetes were forced into a defensive role they were never designed for, protecting fixed, crumbling walls against an enemy that no longer needed to chase them to kill them. For a quirky fringe tidbit, during the final years of the war, the Nasrid riders supposedly began to coat their horses' hooves with a mixture of pitch and charcoal to make them invisible during night raids against the Spanish cannon batteries. There are accounts of shadow riders who would gallop into the Spanish camps and spike the cannons, driving iron nails into the touch holes to disable them. It was a desperate, high-stakes return to the guerrilla tactics of the early Acifas, but this time, the ghosts were fighting a machine that never slept. Imagine the smell of burnt pitch and wet gunpowder in the cool Granada night. It's the scent of a dying era. Historians still argue whether the fall of Granada was a military inevitability or a result of the internal civil war within the Nasrid royal family. Some argue that if the Moors had remained unified, their light cavalry could have successfully cut the Spanish supply lines in the treacherous mountain passes of the Alpujarras, potentially stalling the Reconquista for another century. Others contend that the Spanish tercios, the emerging military system of combined pikes and firearms, had already rendered the light cavalry skirmisher obsolete as a primary strategic force. You feel a pang of melancholy as you watch the Nasrid riders retreat back toward the red walls of the Alhambra. They still ride with the same grace, the same high-stepping elegance of their ancestors, but their world has shrunk to a few square miles of jagged peaks and fortified towers. The geometry of frustration we talked about in section 13 has been reversed. Now, it is the Moors who are frustrated, trapped in a cage of fire and iron. You see a rider look back over his shoulder at the Spanish camp, and for the first time in this 25,000-word journey, you see fear in that glance. Not fear of a man, but fear of a future that has no room for his style of war. The deep dive into this warfare is reaching its conclusion because the very nature of the maneuver is being erased. When you can kill a man from 200 yards with a tube of iron, the conversation of battle becomes a monologue. The jinete relied on a shared reality of physical proximity, the throw of a javelin, the turn of a horse. Gunpowder removes the human element of the distance. You realize that the Iron Man didn't actually beat the wind by becoming faster. He beat the wind by inventing a way to strike through it without moving a muscle. As the sun sets over the Sierra Nevada, the peaks turning a bruised purple, you hear the distant rhythmic booming of the Spanish siege guns. It's a slow, mechanical sound that drowns out the heartbeat of the horses. The era of the leathern ghost is ending, not with a climactic charge, but with a steady, grinding pressure. You take a deep breath of the mountain air, knowing that tomorrow, the last king of Granada will surrender the keys to the city. The 800-year dance is over, but as we move toward our final section, you'll see that the ghost isn't quite finished with history yet. It's just preparing to cross an ocean. The red dust of Granada has finally settled, and the last echoes of the Nasrid trumpets have faded into the mountain mists. You are standing on the sun-bleached docks of Seville. The year is now 1493, and the air is thick with the smell of tar, salt, and a strange, new ambition. This is the final section of our journey. You look toward the massive wooden hulls of the galleons, preparing to depart for the Indies. And you notice something familiar being hoisted into the holds. They are the lean, deep-chested horses of the Andalusian plains, the descendants of the Berbers and Arabians that outmaneuvered the Franks for centuries. Beside them, men are stowing adargas and short stirrups. You realize that the leathern ghost isn't dying, it's being exported. The Moorish light cavalry tactics that defined the Iberian Peninsula are about to become the blueprint for the conquest of an entire new world. You watch a veteran of the Granada War, a man who spent his youth chasing shadows in the Alpujarras, check the cinch on his saddle. He isn't wearing the heavy plate of a Burgundian knight. He's wearing a light breastplate and a leather tunic, his knees tucked high in that iconic a la jinete stance. He is the conquistador, a biological and tactical hybrid created by 800 years of friction. He has the iron of the north in his blood and the wind of the south in his stirrups. You realize that the outmaneuvering we've studied was actually a long, brutal gestation period. The Spanish didn't just win the Reconquista, they were forged by it into the most effective light-heavy hybrid force the world had ever seen. A mainstream historical fact. The horse of the Americas is almost entirely descended from the Iberian stock brought over during these early voyages. The Mustangs of the American West and the Criollos of the South are the direct genetic legacy of the Moorish light cavalry's engine. Furthermore, the tactics used by men like Hernan Cortes and Francisco Pizarro, relying on extreme mobility, psychological shock and awe, and the ability to fight in broken terrain, were the exact same maneuvers their ancestors had learned from the Berbers. For a quirky fringe tidbit, the very word cowboy and the culture of the American West can trace its DNA back to the Moorish jinete. The Western saddle, with its high pommel and horn, is a direct evolution of the Iberian war saddle, and the rodeo finds its roots in the hastaludios, the spear games that Moorish and Christian riders played during periods of truce to show off their agility. You probably wouldn't survive a 16th century Atlantic crossing, but your cultural descendants are still wearing the boots and using the bits that were perfected in the dust of Al-Andalus. Historians still argue whether the Spanish success in the Americas was due to their superior European technology or their borrowed Moorish tactics. Some argue that without the a la jinete style of riding, which allowed Spanish horsemen to navigate the jungles and mountains of the New World, the conquest would have been impossible. Others suggest it was the biological maneuver, the introduction of the horse itself to a continent that had never seen one that did the heavy lifting. Either way, the ghost of the Moor was the silent partner in every charge made across the Atlantic. You look out at the horizon, where the sea meets the sky in a shimmering blue line. You think back to Section 1, the dusty plains of Guadalete, how far we've traveled. We've seen the heavy knights melt in their armor, the light cavalry dance in the mountains, and the slow, grinding evolution of a martial culture that eventually learned to breathe through the heat. You realize that outmaneuvering isn't just about speed, it's about the ability to absorb your enemy's strengths until you become something more resilient than either of you started. The Moorish light cavalry may have lost the peninsula, but they won the future by rewriting the DNA of the people who replaced them. The sun is low now, casting a long golden path across the water. You feel the weight of the centuries we've covered, the 25,000 words of dust, blood, and innovation. The deep dive is complete. You've seen how a smaller horse and a shorter stirrup changed the map of the world. You've seen how honor can be a trap and how cunning can be a shield. As the ships begin to pull away from the docks, their sails catching the evening breeze. You take a final look at the red soil of Spain. It is a land built on the rhythm of the gallop, a place where the wind still carries the faint, ghostly sound of a drum and the whistle of a javelin. The world is growing quiet now, the frantic energy of the battlefield fading into a soft, velvet hum. The dust that choked the air at Sagrajas and Alarzos has finally settled, coating the memories of the Iron Men and the leathern ghosts in a layer of peaceful stillness. You can feel the coolness of the evening air as it brushes against your skin. A gentle reminder that the long, sun-scorched day of history has finally come to an end. The horses are all back in their paddocks, their breathing slow and rhythmic, their hearts finding the steady cadence of rest as the stars begin to watch over the silent Sierras. There is no more need for the shield or the spear, no more need for the heavy mail or the watchful eye of the scout. The frontiers have closed, the borders have softened into shadows, and the great conversation of battle has drifted into a quiet whisper. You are safe, you are still, and the journey is complete. Let the images of the shifting sands and the golden plateaus fade away into a dream of wide open spaces where the wind moves freely, unburdened by the weight of iron. Everything is as it should be. The story has been told, the path has been walked, and now it is time to simply be. Sleep comes easily now, like a rider returning home at dusk, guided by the familiar light of a distant fire.